Chapter 20 of Dawn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sunny. Dawn by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 20. With Chin Up. Keith came in April, the day before he was expected. Susan, sweeping off the side porch, was accosted by Mrs. McGuire. It was the first warm spring-like day, and Mrs. McGuire, bareheaded and coatless, had opened the backyard gate and was picking her way across the spongy turf. "My, but isn't this a great day, Susan?" she called with an ecstatic, indrawn breath. "I only wish it was nice underfoot." "Hain't you got no rubbers on?" Susan's disapproving eyes sought Mrs. McGuire's feet. Mrs. McGuire laughed lightly. "No, that's the one thing I leave off the first possible minute. Some way I feel as if I was helpin' along the spring." "Humph! Well, I should help along somethin' 'sides spring, I guess, if I did it. Besides, it strikes me rubbers ain't the only thing you're leavin' off." Susan's disapproving eyes had swept now to Mrs. McGuire's unprotected head and shoulders. "Oh, I'm not cold. I love it. As if this glorious spring sunshine could do anyone any harm, Susan. It's Lieutenant McGuire now. I came over to tell you. My John's been promoted." "Sho! You don't say! Ain't that wonderful now?" Susan's broom stopped in midair. "Not when you know my John." The proud mother lifted her head a little. "For bravery and valiant service, Lieutenant McGuire. Oh, Susan, Susan, but I'm the proud woman this morning." "Yes, of course, of course. I ain't wonderin' you be." Susan drew a long sigh and fell into sweeping again. Mrs. McGuire, looking into Susan's face, came a step nearer. Her own face sobered. "And me braggin' like this when you folks, I know you're thinkin' of that poor blind boy, and it's just tomorrow that he comes, isn't it?" Susan nodded dumbly. "And it's all ended now and decided? He can't ever see, I s'pose?" went on Mrs. McGuire. "I heard him talkin' down at the store last night. It seems terrible." "Yes, it does." Susan was sweeping vigorously now, over and over again in the same place. "I wonder how he'll take it." Susan stopped sweeping and turned with a jerk. "Take it? He's got to take it, ain't he?" she demanded fiercely. "He's got to, and things you've got to do, you do. That's all. You'll see. Keith Burton ain't no quitter. He'll take it with his head up and his shoulders braced. I know. You'll see. Don't I remember the look on his blessed face that day he went away and stood on them steps there, callin' back his cheery good-bye?" "But, Susan, there was hope then, and there isn't any now, and you haven't seen him since. You forget that." "No, I don't," retorted Susan doggedly. "I ain't forgettin' nothin', but you'll see." "And he's older. He realizes more. Why, he must be how old is he, anyway?" "He'll be 19 next June." "Almost a man. Poor boy, poor boy. And him with all these years of black darkness ahead of him. I tell you, Susan, I never appreciated my eyes as I have since Keith lost his. Seems as though anybody that's got their eyes hadn't ought to complain of anything. I was thinking this morning, comin' over, how good it was just to see the blue sky and the sunshine and the little buds breakin' through their brown jackets. Why, Susan, I never realized how good just seein' was, till I thought of Keith, who can't never see again." "Yes, well, I've got to go now, Miss McGuire. Good-bye." Words, manner, and tone of voice were discourteous itself, but Mrs. McGuire, looking at Susan's quivering face, brimming eyes, and set lips, knew it for what it was and did not mistake it for discourtesy. But because she knew Susan would prefer it so, she hurried away with a light "Yes, so bye. Good-bye," which gave no sign that she had seen and understood. Dr. Stewart came himself with Keith to Hinsdale and accompanied him to the house. It had been the doctor's own suggestion that neither the boy's father nor Susan should meet them at the train. Perhaps the doctor feared for that meeting. Naturally, it would not be an easy one. Naturally, too, he did not want to add one straw to Keith's already grievous burden. So he had written, "I will come to the house, as I am a little uncertain as to the train I can catch from Boston. Do not try to meet me at the station." "Just as if we couldn't see through that subterranean," Susan had muttered to herself over the dishes that morning. "I guess he knows what train he's going to take, all right. He just didn't want us to meet him and make a scenic at the depot. I wonder if he thinks I would. Don't he think I knows anything?" But after all, it was very simple, very quiet, very ordinary. Dr. Stewart rang the bell, and Susan went to the door. And there they stood, Keith, big and strong and handsome. Susan had forgotten that 2 years could transform a somewhat awkward boy into so fine and stalwart a youth. The doctor, pale and with apprehensive uncertainty in his eyes. "Well, Susan, how are you?" Keith's voice was strong and steady, and the outstretched hand gripped hers with a clasp that hurt. Then, in some way never quite clear to her, Susan found herself in the big living room, with Keith and the doctor and Daniel Burton all shaking hands and all talking at once. They sat down then, and their sentences became less broken, less incoherent. But they said only ordinary things about the day, the weather, the journey home, John McGuire, the war, the President's message, the entry of the United States into conflict. There was nothing whatsoever said about the eyes that could see, or eyes that could not see, or operations that failed. And by the doctor got up and said that he must go. To be sure, the good-byes were a little hurriedly spoken, and the voices were a little higher pitched than was usual, and when the doctor had gone, Keith and his father went at once upstairs to the studio and shut the door. Susan went out to the kitchen and took up her neglected work. She made a great clatter of pans and dishes, and she sang lustily at her mad song and at several others. But every now and then, between songs and rattles, she would stop and listen intently, and twice she climbed halfway up the back stairs and stood poised, her breath suspended, her anxious eyes on that closed studio door. Yet supper that night was another very ordinary occurrence, with Keith and his father talking of the war, and Susan waiting upon them with a cheerfulness that was almost obtrusive. In her own room that night, however, Susan addressed an imaginary Keith, all in the dark. "You're fine and splendid, and I love you for it, Keith, my boy," she choked. "But you don't fool your old Susan. Your chin is up, just as I said 'twould be, and you're marching straight ahead. But inside your heart is breaking. Do you think I don't know? But we ain't going to let each other know. We know. Keith, my boy, not much we ain't. And I guess if you can march straight ahead with your chin up, the rest of us can, all right. We'll see." And Susan was singing again the next morning when she did her breakfast dishes. Then at 10 o'clock Keith came into the kitchen. "Where's Dad, Susan?" "He isn't in the studio, and I've looked in every room in the house. I can't find him anywhere." Keith spoke with the aggrieved air of one who had been deprived of his just rights. Susan's countenance changed. "Why, Keith, don't you, that is, your father, didn't he tell you?" stammered Susan. "Tell me what?" "Why, that he was going to be away." "No, he didn't. What do you mean? Away where? How long?" "Why, working." "Sketching in this storm? Nonsense, Susan. Besides, he'd have taken me. He always took me. Susan, what's the matter? Where is Dad?" A note of uncertainty, almost fear, had crept into the boy's voice. "You're keeping something from me." Susan caught her breath and threw a swift look into Keith's unseeing eyes. Then she laughed hysterically and a bit noisily. "Keepin' something from you? Why, sure we ain't, boy. Didn't I just tell you? He's workin' down to McGuire's." "Working down to McGuire's?" Keith plainly did not yet understand. "Sure, and he's got a real good position, too." Susan spoke jauntily, enthusiastically. "But the McGuires never buy pictures," frowned Keith. "Or want—" He stopped short. Face, voice, and manner underwent a complete change. "Susan, you don't mean that Dad is clerking down there behind that grocery counter?" Susan saw and recognized the utter horror and dismay in Keith's face, and quailed before it. But she managed in some way to keep her voice still triumphant. "Sure he is, and he gets real good wages, too, and—" But Keith, with a low cry, had gone. Before the noon dinner, however, he appeared again at the kitchen door. His face was very white now. "Susan, how long has Dad been doing this?" "Oh, quite a while. Funny now, ain't he never told you?" "No, but there seems to be quite a number of things that you people haven't told me." Susan winced, but she still held her ground jauntily. "Oh, yes, quite a while," she nodded cheerfully. "And he gets—" "But doesn't he paint any more at all?" interrupted the boy sharply. "Why, no, I don't think that he does," tossed Susan airily. "And of course, if he's found something he likes better—" "Susan, you don't have to talk like that to me," interposed Keith quietly. "I understand, of course. There are some things that can be seen without eyes." "Oh, but honest, Keith, he—" But once again Keith had gone, and Susan found herself talking to empty air. When Susan went to the dining room that evening to wait at dinner, she went with fear and trepidation, and she looked apprehensively into the faces of the two men sitting opposite each other. But in the kitchen, a few minutes later, she muttered to herself, "Pooh, I needn't have worried. They've got sense, both of 'em, and they know that's what's got to be, that's all. And that it don't do no good to fuss. I needn't have worried." But Susan did worry. She did not like the look on Keith's face. She did not like the nervous twitching of his hands. She did not like the exaggerated cheerfulness of his manner. And Keith was cheerful. He played solitaire with his marked cards and whistled. He worked at his raised picture puzzles and sang snatches of merry songs. He talked with anybody who came near him, talked very fast, and laughed a great deal. But behind the whistling and the singing and the laughter, Susan detected a tense strain and nervousness that she did not like. And at times, when she knew Keith thought himself alone, there was an expression on his face that disturbed Susan not a little. But because outwardly it was all cheerfulness, Susan kept her peace, but she also kept her eyes on Keith. End of chapter 20. Recording by Sunny. Chapter 21 of Dawn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sunny. Dawn by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 21. The Lion. Keith had not been home a week before it was seen that Hinsdale was inclined to make a lion of the boy. Women brought him jelly and fruit, and men clapped him on the shoulder and said, "How are you, my boy?" in voices that were not quite steady. Young girls brought him flowers and asked Susan if they could not read or sing or do something to amuse him. Children stood about the gate and stared, talking in awestruck whispers, happy if they could catch a glimpse of his face at the window. A part of this Susan succeeded in keeping from Keith. Susan had a well-founded belief that Keith would not care to be a lion, but a great deal of it came to his knowledge, of course, in spite of anything she could do. However, she told herself that she need not have worried, for if Keith had recognized it for what it was, he made no sign, and even Susan herself could find no fault with his behavior. He was cordial, cheery, almost gay, outwardly, but inwardly Susan was still keeping her eyes on Keith. Mrs. McGuire came often to see Keith. She said she knew he would want to hear John's letters, and there were all the old ones, besides the new ones that came from time to time. She brought them all and read them to him. She talked about the young soldier, too, a great deal, to the blind boy. She explained to Susan that she wanted to do everything she could to get him out of himself and interest him in the world outside, and that she didn't know any better way to do it than to tell him of these brave soldiers who were doing something so really worthwhile in the world. "And he's so interested, the dear boy," she concluded with a sigh, "and so brave. I think he's the bravest thing I ever saw, Susan Betts." "Yes, he is brave," said Susan a little shortly. so shortly that Mrs. McGuire opened her eyes a bit and wondered why Susan's lips had snapped tight shut in that straight, hard line. "But what ails the woman?" she muttered to herself, vexedly, as she crossed the backyard to her own door. "Wasn't she herself always bragging about his being so brave? Huh! There's no such thing as pleasing some folks, it seems," finished Mrs. McGuire as she entered her own door. But Mrs. McGuire was not the only frequent caller. There was Mazie Sanborn. Mazie began by coming every 2 or 3 days with flowers and fudge. Then she brought the latest novel one day and suggested that she read it to Keith. Susan was skeptical of this, even fearful. She had not forgotten Keith's frenzied avoidance of such callers in the old days. But to her surprise now, Keith welcomed Mazie joyously. So joyously that Susan began to suspect that behind the joyousness lay an eagerness to welcome anything that would help him forget himself. She was more suspicious of this during these days that followed, as she saw this same nervous eagerness displayed every time anyone called the house. Susan's joy then at Keith's gracious response to visitors' attentions changed to a vague uneasiness. Behind and beyond it all lay an intangible something upon which Susan could not place her finger, but which filled her heart with distrust. And so still she kept her eyes on Keith. In June Dorothy Parkman came to Hinsdale. She came at once to see Susan, but she would only step inside the hall, and she spoke low and hurriedly, looking fearfully towards the closed doors beyond the stairway. "I had to come to see how he was," she began a little breathlessly, "and I wanted to ask you if you thought I could do any good or to be any help to him, either as Miss Stewart or Dorothy Parkman. Only I suppose I would have to be Dorothy Parkman now. I couldn't keep the other up forever, of course. But I don't know how to tell." She stopped and looked again fearfully towards the closed doors. "Susan, how is he?" she finished unsteadily. "He's well, very well. He sees people. Mazie says he sees everybody now." "Yes, oh yes, he sees people. That's why I thought perhaps he wouldn't mind me now. I mean the real me," faltered the girl wistfully. "Maybe." Susan sighed and frown expressed doubt. "But he's real brave," challenged the girl quickly. "Mazie said he was." "I know. Everybody says he's brave." There was an odd constraint in Susan's voice, but the girl was too intent on her own problem to notice it. "And that's why I hoped about me, you know, that he wouldn't mind now. And, of course, it can't make any difference about his eyes, for he doesn't need father or anyone now." Her voice broke. "Oh, Susan, I want to help some way if I can. Would he see me, do you think?" "He ought to. He sees everybody else." "I know. Mazie says—" "Does Mazie know about you?" interrupted Susan. "I mean about your being Miss Stewart?" "A little, but not much. I told her once that he most always called me Miss Stewart, but I never made anything of it. And I never told her how much I saw of him at home. Some way She stopped short with a quick indraw of her breath. In the doorway down the hall stood Keith. "Susan, I thought I heard— Was Miss Stewart here?" he demanded excitedly. With only the briefest of hesitation and a half-despairing, half-relieved look into Susan's startled eyes, the young girl hurried forward. "Indeed I'm here," she cried gaily, giving a warm clasp to his eagerly outstretched hand. "How do you do?" Susan was just saying— But Susan was gone with upflung hands and a look that said, "No, you don't rake me into this thing, young lady," as plainly as if she had spoken the words themselves. In the living room, a minute later, Keith began eager questioning. "When did you come?" "Yesterday." "And you came to see me the very next day? Weren't you good? You knew I wanted to see you." "Oh, but I didn't," she laughed a little embarrassedly. "You're at home now, and you have all your old friends, and—" "But they're not you. There's not anyone like you," cut in the youth fervently. "And now you're going to stay a long time, aren't you?" Yes, several weeks, probably." "Good. And you'll come every day to see me?" "Well, as to that, it's too much to ask, of course," broke off Keith contritely. "And truly, I don't want to impose on you." "No, no, it isn't that," protested the girl quickly. "It's only there are so many—" "But I told you there isn't anybody else like you, Miss Stewart. There isn't anyone here that understands like you. And it was you who first taught me to do so many things," his voice faltered. He paused, wet his lips, then plunged on hurriedly. "Miss Stewart, I don't say this sort of thing very often. I never said it before to anybody. But I want you to know that I understood and appreciated just what you were doing all those weeks for me out there in the sanatorium. And it was the way you did it, with never a word or a hint that I was different. You did things, and you made me do things without reminding me at all the time that I was blind. I shall never forget that first day when you told me Dad would want to hear from me, and then before I could say a word you put that paper in my hands, and my fingers fell on those lines that I could feel. And how I blessed you for not telling me those lines were there. Don't you see? Everybody here that comes to see me tells me the lines are there." "Yes, I know." The girl's voice was low, a little breathless. "And that's why I need you so much. If anybody in the world can make me forget for a minute, you can. You will come?" "Why, of course I'll come and be glad to. You know I will. And I'm so glad if I've helped any." "You've helped more than you'll ever know. But come, look, I've got a dandy new game here." And Keith, very obviously to hide the shake in his voice and the emotion in his face, turned gaily to a little stand near him and picked up a square cardboard box. Half an hour later, Dorothy Parkman, passing through the hall on her way to the outer door, was waylaid by Susan. "Shh! Don't speak to me here, but come with me," she whispered, leading the way through the dining room. In the kitchen she stopped and turned eagerly. "Well, did you tell him?" she demanded. Miss Dorothy shook her head, mutely, despairingly. "You mean he don't know yet that you're Dorothy Parkman?" "I mean just that." "But, child alive, he'll find out. He can't help finding out now." "I know, but I just couldn't tell him. I couldn't, Susan. I tried to do it 2 or 3 times. Indeed I did. But the words just wouldn't come out. And now I don't know when I can tell him." "But he was tickled to death to see you. He showed it, Miss Dorothy." "I know." A soft pink suffused the young girl's face. But it was Miss Stewart he was glad to see, not Dorothy Parkman. And after the things he said— She stopped and looked back over her shoulder towards the room she had just left. "But, Miss Dorothy, don't you see? It'll be all right now. You've shown him that you don't mind being with blind folks a mite. So now he won't care a bit when he knows you're Dorothy Parkman." But the girl shook her head again. "Yes, I know he might not mind that part, perhaps. But I know he'd mind the deceit and all those long months. And it wouldn't be easy to make him understand. He'd never forgive it. I know he wouldn't. To think I'd taken advantage of his not being able to see." "Nonsense! Of course he would." "He wouldn't. You don't know. Just today he said something about someone who had tried to deceive him in a little thing because he was blind, and I could see how bitter he was." "But what are you going to do?" "I don't know, Susan. It's harder than ever now," almost moaned the girl. "You're coming again?" "Yes, oh yes, I shall come as long as he'll let me. I know he wants me to. I know I have helped a little. He spoke beautifully about that today. But whether after he finds out—" Her voice choked into silence and she turned her head quite away. "There, dear, don't you fret," Susan comforted her. "You just go home and think no more about it. When thinking won't mend it, then thinking won't end it. So what's the use? When you get ready, you just come on again, and you keep a-comin' too. It'll all work out right. You see if it don't." "Thank you, Susan. Oh, I'll come as long as I can," sighed the girl, turning to go. "But I'm not sure how it'll turn out," she finished with a wistful smile over her shoulder as she opened the door. End of chapter 21. Recording by Sunny. Chapter 22 of Dawn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sunny. Dawn by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 22. How could you, Maisie? As Miss Dorothy herself had said, it could not, of course, continue. She came once and once again to see Keith, and in spite of her efforts to make her position clear to him, her secret still remained her own. Then, on the third visit, the dreaded disclosure came, naturally, in the simplest, most unexpected way. Yet in a way that would most certainly have been the last choice of Miss Dorothy herself, could she have had aught to say about it. The two, Keith and Dorothy, had had a wonderful hour over a book that Dorothy had brought to read. They had been sitting on the porch, and Dorothy had risen to go, when there came a light tread on the front walk, and Maisie Sanborn tripped up the porch steps. "Well, Dorothy Parkman, is this where you were?" she cried gaily. "I was hunting all over the house for you half-hour ago." "Dorothy Parkman!" Keith was on his feet. His face had grown very white. Dorothy, too, her eyes on Keith's face, had grown very white. Yet she managed to give a light laugh, and her voice matched Maisie's own for gaiety. "Were you? Well, I was right here. But I'm going now." "But, Miss Stewart," Keith's colorless lips spoke the words just above his breath. "Why, Keith Burton, what's the matter?" laughed Maisie. "You look as if you'd seen a ghost. Oh, forgive that word, Keith," she broke off in light apology. "I'm always forgetting and talking as if you could really see. But you looked so funny, and you brought out that Dorothy Parkman with such surprised air, just as if you didn't ever call her that in old school days. Keith Burton. Oh, Dorothy told me you called her Miss Stewart a lot now, but—" "Yes, I have called her Miss Stewart quite a lot lately," interposed Keith, in a voice so quietly self-controlled that even Dorothy herself was almost deceived. But not quite. Dorothy saw the clenched muscles and white knuckles of his hands as he gripped the chair back before him, and she knew too much to expect him to offer his hand in good-bye. So she backed away, and she still spoke lightly, inconsequently, though she knew her voice was shaking as she made her adieus. "Well, good-bye. I must be going now. Sure. I'll be over tomorrow, though, to finish the book. Good-bye." "Good-bye," said Keith, and Dorothy wondered if Maisie noticed that he quite omitted a polite "come again," and if Maisie saw that as he had said the terse good-bye, he put both hands suddenly and resolutely behind his back. Dorothy saw it, and at home, long hours later, she was still crying over it. She went early to the Burtons the next forenoon. "I came to finish the book I was reading to Mr. Keith," she told Susan brightly as her ring was answered. "I thought I'd come early before anybody else got here." She would have stepped in, but Susan's ample figure still barred the way. "Well, now, that's too bad." Susan's voice expressed genuine concern and personal disappointment. "Ain't it a shame? Keith said he wa'n't feelin' nohow well this mornin', and that he didn't want to see no one, and under no circumstances not to let no one in to see him. But maybe if I told him it was you—" No, don't do that," cried the girl hurriedly. I'll come again some other time." On the street a minute later she whispered tremulously, "He did that on purpose, of course. He knew I would come this morning. But he can't keep this up forever. He'll have to see me sometime, and when he does—oh, if only Maisie Sanborn hadn't blurted it out like that! Why didn't I tell him? But I will tell him. He can't keep this up forever." When on the second and third and fourth morning, however, Dorothy had found Susan's figure barring the way, and had received the same distressed "He says he won't see no one, Miss Dorothy," from Susan's plainly troubled lips, Dorothy began to think Keith did mean to keep it up forever. "But what is it, Susan?" she faltered. "Is he sick? Really sick?" "I don't know, Miss Dorothy," frowned Susan, "but I don't like the looks of it anyhow. He says he ain't sick, not physically sick, but he just don't want to talk and see folks, and he's been like that most a week now, and I'm free to confess I don't like it." "But what does he do all day?" asked the girl. "Nothing that I can see," Susan said profoundly. "Oh, he plays that solitary and putters a little with some of his raised books, but mostly he just sits and thinks, and I don't like it. If only his father were here. But with him gone peddling molasses and no one 'lowed into the house, there ain't nothing for him to do but think, and 'tain't right nor good for him. I've watched him, and I know." "But he used to see people, Susan." "I know. He saw everybody." "Do you know why he won't now?" asked the girl a little faintly. "I ain't the faintest inception of an idea. It came as sudden as that," declared Susan, snapping her finger. "Then he hasn't said anything special about not wanting to see me?" "Why, no. Do you mean, has he found out?" demanded Susan, interrupting herself excitedly. "Yes, he found out last Monday afternoon. Mazie ran up on the porch and called me by name right out. Oh, Susan, it was awful. I shall never forget the look on that boy's face as long as I live." "Land sakes! Monday!" breathed Susan. "And Tuesday he began refusing to see folks? Then of course that was it. But why won't he see other folks? They ain't anything to do with you." "I don't know, unless he didn't want to tell you specially not to let me in, and so he said not to let anybody in." "Was he awful mad?" "It wasn't so much anger as it was grief and hurt, and oh, I can't express what it was, but I saw it, and I never shall forget it. You see, to have it blurted out to him like that without any warning, and of course he couldn't understand." "But didn't you explain things, how 'twas in the first place?" She shook her head. "I couldn't, not with Mazie there. I said I'd come next morning to finish the book. I thought he'd understand. I was going to explain then. He probably did, and that's why he won't let me in. He doesn't want any explanation," sighed the girl tremulously. "Well, he ought to want 'em," asserted Susan with vigor. "'Tain't fair nor right nor sensible for him to act like this, makin' a mountain out of an ant hill. I declare, Miss Dorothy, he ought to be made to see you." The girl flushed and drew back. "Most certainly not, Susan. I'm not in the habit of making people see me when they don't wish to. Do you suppose I'm going to beg and tease, 'Please, won't you let me see you?' Hardly. He need not worry. I shall not come again." "Oh, Miss Dorothy!" remonstrated Susan. "Why, of course I won't, Susan," cried the girl. "Do you suppose I'm going to keep him from seeing other people just because he's afraid you'll have to let me in, too? Nonsense, Susan. Even you must admit I cannot allow that. You may tell Mr. Keith, please, that he may feel no further uneasiness. I shall not trouble him again." "Oh, Miss Dorothy!" begged Susan agitatedly once more. But Miss Dorothy, with all the hurt dignity of her 18 years, turned haughtily away, leaving Susan, impotent and distressed, looking after her. 2 minutes later Susan sought Keith in the living room. Her whole self spelt irate determination, but Keith could not see that. Keith, listless and idle-handed, sat in his favorite chair by the window. "Dorothy Parkman just rang the bell," began Susan, "and—" "But I said I'd see no one," interrupted Keith, instantly alert. "That's what I told her, and she's gone." "Oh, all right." Keith relaxed into his old listlessness. "And she said to please tell you she'd trouble you no further, so you might let in the others now as soon as you please." Keith sat erect in his chair with a jerk. "What did she mean by that?" "I guess you don't need me to tell you," observed Susan grimly. With a shrug and an irritable gesture, Keith settled back in his chair. "I don't care to discuss it, Susan. I don't wish to see any one. We'll let it go at that, if you please," he said. "But I don't please." Susan was in the room now, close to Keith's chair. Her face was quivering with emotion. "Keith, won't you listen to reason? It ain't like you might to sit back like this and refuse to see a nice little body like Dorothy Parkman that's been so kind—" "Susan!" Keith was sitting erect again. His face was white and carried a stern anguish that Susan had never seen before. "I don't care to discuss Miss Parkman with you or with anybody else. Neither do I care to discuss the fact that I thoroughly understand, of course, that you or she or anybody else can fool me into believing anything you please, and I can't help myself." "No, no, Keith, don't take it like that. Please don't." "Is there any other way I can take it? Do you think Miss Stewart could have made such a fool of me if I'd had eyes to see Dorothy Parkman?" "But she was only trying to help you, and—" "I don't want to be helped," stormed the boy hotly. "Did it ever occur to you, Susan, that I might sometimes like to help somebody myself, instead of this everlasting having somebody help me?" "But you do help. You help me," asserted Susan feverishly, working her nervous fingers together. "And you'd help me more if you'd only let folks in to see you, and—" All right, interrupted Keith testily. "Let them in. Let everybody in. I don't care. What's the difference? But please, please, Susan, stop making any more about it all now." And Susan stopped. There were times when Susan knew enough to stop, and this was one of them. But she took him at his word, and when Mrs. McGuire came the next day with a letter from her John, Susan ushered her into the living room where Keith was sitting alone, and Keith welcomed her with at least a good imitation of his old heartiness. Mrs. McGuire said she had such a funny letter to read today. She knew he'd enjoy it, and Susan would too, particularly the part that John had quoted from something that had been printed by the British soldiers in France and circulated among their comrades in the trenches and hospitals and everywhere. John had written it off on a separate piece of paper, and this was it: "Don't worry. There's nothing to worry about. You have two alternatives. Either you're mobilized or you're not. If not, you have nothing to worry about. If you are mobilized, you have two alternatives. You are in camp or at the front. If you're in camp, you have nothing to worry about. If you're at the front, you have two alternatives. Either you are on the fighting line or in reserve. If in reserve, you have nothing to worry about. If you are on the fighting line, you have two alternatives. Either you fight or you don't. If you don't, you have nothing to worry about. If you do, you have two alternatives. Either you get hurt or you don't. If you don't, you have nothing to worry about. If you are hurt, you have two alternatives. Either you're slightly hurt or badly. If slightly, you have nothing to worry about. If badly, you have two alternatives. Either you recover or you don't. If you recover, you have nothing to worry about. If you don't, you have followed my advice clear through. You have done with worry forever." Mrs. McGuire was in a gale of laughter by the time she had finished reading this. So, too, was Susan. Keith also was laughing, but his laughter did not have any of the really genuine ring to it, which fact did not escape Susan. "Well, anyhow, he let Miss McGuire in, and that's something," she muttered to herself as Mrs. McGuire took her departure. "Besides, he talked to her real pleasant, and that's more." As the days passed, others came also, and Keith talked with them. He even allowed Dorothy Parkman to be admitted one day. Dorothy had not come until long urging on the part of Susan and the assurance that Keith had said he would see her. Even then nothing would have persuaded her, she told Susan, except the great hope that she could say something in some way that would set her right in Keith's eyes. So with fear and trembling and with a painful embarrassment on her face, but with a great hope in her heart, she entered the room and came straight to Keith's side. For a moment the exultation of a fancied success sent a warm glow all through her, for Keith had greeted her pleasantly and even extended his hand. But almost at once the glow faded, and the great hope died in her heart, for she saw that even while she touched his hand, he was yet miles away from her. He laughed and talked with her. Oh, yes, but he laughed too much and talked too much. He gave her almost no chance to say anything herself. And what he said was so inconsequential and so far removed from anything intimately concerning themselves that the girl found it utterly impossible to make the impassioned explanation which she had been saying over and over again all night to herself, and from which she had hoped so much. Yet at the last, just before she bade him good-bye, she did manage to say something. But in her disappointment and excitement and embarrassment, her words were blurted out haltingly and ineffectually, and they were not at all the ones she had practiced over and over to herself in the long night watches, nor were they received as she had palpitatingly pictured that they would be, with Keith first stern and hurt, and then just dear and forgiving and understanding. Keith was neither stern nor hurt. He still laughed pleasantly, and he tossed her whole labored explanation aside with a light, "Certainly, of course, to be sure, not at all. You did quite right, I assure you." And then he remarked that it was a warm day, wasn't it? And Dorothy found herself hurrying down the Burton front walk with burning cheeks and a chagrined helplessness that left her furious and with an ineffable cheap feeling, yet not able to put her finger on any discourteous flaw in Keith's punctilious politeness. "I wish I'd never said a word, not a word," she muttered hotly to herself as she hurried down the street. "I wonder if he thinks I'll ever open my head to him about it again. Well, he needn't worry. But oh, Keith, Keith, how could you?" she choked brokenly. Then abruptly she turned down the side street, lest Mazie Sanborn come toward her, should she see the big tears that were rolling down her cheeks. End of chapter 22. Recording by Sunny. Chapter 23 of Dawn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sunny. Dawn by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 23. John McGuire. So imperative was the knock at the kitchen door at 6 o'clock that July morning that Susan almost fell down the back stairs in her haste to obey the summons. "Land sakes, Miss McGuire, what a start you did give! Why, Miss McGuire, what is it?" She interrupted herself, aghast, as Mrs. McGuire, white-faced and wild-eyed, swept past her and began to pace up and down the kitchen floor, moaning frenziedly. It's come, I knew it would come. Oh, what shall I do, what shall I do?" "What's come?" "Oh, John, John, my boy, my boy." "You don't mean he's dead?" "No, no, worse than that, moaned the woman, wringing her hands. "Oh, what shall I do, what shall I do?" With a firm grasp Susan caught the twisting fingers and gently but resolutely forced their owner into a chair. "Do? You just calm yourself right down and tell me all about it, Miss McGuire. This rampaging around the kitchen like this don't do no sort of good, and it's awful on your nerves. And furthermore, and moreover, no matter what it is that ails your John, it can't be worse than death. For while there's life, there's hope, you know." "But it is, I tell you," sobbed Mrs. McGuire, still swaying her body back and forth. "Susan, my boy is blind." With the utterance of the dread word, Mrs. McGuire stiffened suddenly into rigid horror, her eyes staring straight into Susan's. "Miss McGuire!" breathed Susan in dismay. Then hopefully, "But maybe 'twas a mistake." The woman shook her head. She went back to her swaying from side to side. "No, 'twas a dispatch. It came this morning, just now. Mr. McGuire was gone, and there wasn't anybody there but the children, and they're asleep. That's why I came over. I had to talk to someone." "Of course you did, and you shall, you poor lamb. You should tell me all about it. What was it? What happened?" "I don't know. I just know he's blind, and that he's coming home. He's on his way now. My John blind. Oh, Susan, what shall I do? What shall I do?" "Then he probably ain't sick or hurt anywheres else, if he is on his way home. Leastwise, he ain't hurt bad. You can be glad for that, Mrs. McGuire." I don't know. Maybe he is. It didn't say. It just said blinded," chattered Mrs. McGuire feverishly. "They get them home just as soon as they can when they're blinded. We were reading about it only yesterday in the paper, how they did send 'em home right away. Oh, how little I thought that my son John would be one of 'em. My John!" "But your John ain't the only one, Mis' McGuire. There's other Johns, too. Look at our Keith here." I know. "An' I wonder how he'll take this about your John." "He'll know what it means," choked Mrs. McGuire. "He sure will, an' he'll feel bad, I know. He ain't hisself anyway these days." "He ain't?" Mrs. McGuire asked the question abstractly, her mind plainly on her own trouble. But Susan, intent on her trouble, did not need even the question to spur her tongue. "No, he ain't. Oh, he's brave and cheerful. He's awful cheerful, even cheerfuller than he was a month ago. He's too cheerful, Mis' McGuire. There's somethin' back of it I don't like. But Mrs. McGuire was not listening. Wringing her hands, she had sprung to her feet and was pacing the floor again, moaning, "Oh, what shall I do? What shall I do?" A minute later, only weeping afresh at Susan's every effort to comfort her, she stumbled out of the kitchen and hurried across the yard to her own door. Watching her from the window, Susan drew a long sigh. "I wonder how he will take But land sakes, this ain't gettin' my breakfast," she ejaculated with a hurried glance at the clock on the little shelf above the stove. There was nothing apparently to distinguish breakfast that morning from a dozen other breakfasts that had gone before. Keith and his father talked cheerfully of various matters, and Susan waited upon them with her usual briskness. If Susan was more silent than usual, and if her eyes sought Keith's face more frequently than was her habit, no one apparently noticed it. Susan did fancy, however, that she saw a new tenseness in Keith's face, a new nervousness in his manner. But that, perhaps, was because she was watching him so closely, and because he was so constantly in her mind, owing to her apprehension as to how he would take the news of John McGuire's blindness. From the very first, Susan had determined not to tell her news until after Mr. Burton had left the house. She could not have explained it, even to herself, but she had a feeling that it would be better to tell Keith when he was alone. She planned, also, to tell him casually, as it were, in the midst of other conversation, not as if it were the one thing on her mind. In accordance with this, therefore, she forced herself to finish her dishes and to set her kitchen in order before she sought Keith in the living-room. But Keith was not in the living-room, neither was he on the porch or anywhere in the yard. With a troubled frown on her face, Susan climbed the stairs to the second floor. Keith's room was silent and empty, so far as human presence was concerned. So, too, was the studio and every other room on that floor. In the front of the attic stairs Susan hesitated. The troubled frown on her face deepened as she glanced up the steep, narrow stairway. She did not like to have Keith go off by himself to the attic, and already now, twice before, she had found him up there poking in the drawers of an old desk that had been his father's. He had shut the doors quickly and laughingly turned aside her questions when she had asked him what in the world he was doing up there. And he had got up immediately and gone downstairs with her, but she had not liked the look on his face. And today, as she hesitated at the foot of the stairs, she was remembering that look, but for only a moment. Resolutely, when she lifted her chin, ran up the stairs and opened the attic door. Over at the desk by the window there was a swift movement, but not so swift that Susan did not see the revolver pushed under some loose papers. "Is that you, Susan?" asked Keith sharply. "Yes, honey. I just came up to get something." Susan's face was white like paper, and her hands were cold and shaking, but her voice, except for a certain breathlessness, was cheerfully steady. With more or less noise, and with a running fire of inconsequent comment, she rummaged among the trunks and boxes, gradually working her way toward the desk where Keith still sat. At the desk, with a sudden, swift movement, she thrust the papers to one side and dropped her hand on the revolver. At the same moment Keith's arm shot out and his hand fell, covering hers. She saw his young face flush and harden and his mouth set into stern lines. "Susan, you'll be good enough, please, to take your hand off that," he said then sharply. There was a moment's tense silence. Susan's eyes, agonized and pleading, were on his face, but Keith could not see that. He could only hear her words a moment later. Light words with a hidden laugh in them, yet spoken with that same curious breathlessness. "Faith, honey, and how can I, with your own hand holding mine so tight?" Keith removed his hand instantly. His set face darkened. "This is not a joke, Susan, and I shall have to depend on your honor to let that revolver stay where it is. Unfortunately, I'm unable to see whether I'm obeyed or not." It was Susan's turn to flush. She drew back at once, leaving the weapon uncovered on the desk between them. "I'm not taking the pistol, Keith." The laugh was all gone from Susan's voice now. So, too, was the breathlessness, and the voice was steady, grave, but very gentle. "We take matches and poisons and knives away from children, not from grown men, Keith. Pistol's right where you can reach it if you want it." She saw the fingers of Keith's hand twitch and tighten. Otherwise there was no answer, and after a moment she went on speaking. "But let me just say this. It ain't like you to be a quitter, Keith." She saw him wince, but she did not wait for him to speak. "And after you've done this thing, there ain't any one in the world going to be so sorry as you'll be. You mark my words." It was like a sharp knife cutting a taut cord. The tense muscles relaxed, and Keith gave a sudden laugh. True, it was a short laugh, and a bitter one, but it was a laugh. "You forget, Susan. If I carried that out, I wouldn't be in the world to care." "Shucks! You'd be in some world, Keith Burton, and you know it. And you'd feel nice looking down on the mess you made of this world, wouldn't you?" "Well, if I was looking, I'd be seeing, wouldn't I?" cut in the youth grimly. "Don't forget, Susan, that I'd be seeing, please." "Seeing ain't everything, Keith Burton. Just remember that. There's some things you'd rather be blind than see, and that's one of 'em. Besides, seeing ain't the only sensible you've got, and there's such a lot of things you can do, and—" "Oh, yes, I know," interrupted Keith fiercely, flinging out both his hands. "I can feel a book and eat my dinner, and I can hear the shouts of the people cheering the boys that go marching by my door, but I'm tired of it all. I tell you I can't stand it. I can't, Susan. Yes, I know that's a cheap way out of it," he went on after a choking pause, with a wave of his hand towards the revolver on the desk. "And a cowardly one, too. I know all that, and maybe I wouldn't have done it today, even if you hadn't come. I found it last week, and it fascinated me. It seemed such an easy way out of it. Since then I've been up here 2 or 3 times just to feel it. Somehow I like to know it was here, and that if it couldn't stand things another minute. But I've tried to be decent. Honest I have. But I'm tired of being amused and tended to like a 10-year-old boy. I don't want flowers and jellies and candies brought to me. I don't want to read and play solitaire and checkers week in and week out. I want to be over there doing a man's work. Look at Ted and Tom and Jack Green and John McGuire." "John McGuire!" It was a faltering cry from Susan, but Keith did not even hear. "What are they doing? What am I doing? Yet you people expect me to sit here contented with a dice box and a deck of playing cards, and be glad I can do that much? Oh, well, I suppose I ought to be, but when I sit here alone day after day, and think and think—" "But, Keith, we don't want you to do that," interposed Susan feverishly. "Now, there's Miss Dorothy. If you'd only let her—" "But I tell you I don't want to be babied and pitied and tended to by young women who are sorry for me. I want to do the helping part of the time. And if I see a girl I could care for, I want to be able to ask her like a man to marry me. And then, if she says yes, I want to be able to take care of her myself, not have her take care of me and marry me out of pity and feed me fudge and flowers. And there's Dad." Keith's voice broke and stopped. Susan watched his impassioned face, wet her lips, and swallowed convulsively. Then Keith began again. "Susan, do you know the one big thing that drives me up here every time in spite of myself? It's the thought of Dad. How do you suppose I feel to think of Dad peddling peas and beans and potatoes down in McGuire's grocery store? Dad!" Susan lifted her head defiantly.
Well, now look here, Keith Burton, let me tell you that peddling peas and bees and potatoes is just as honorary as painting pictures, and I'm not saying it isn't, cut the boy incisively. I'm merely saying that, as I happen to know, he prefers to paint pictures, and I prefer to have him. And he'd be doing it this minute if it wasn't for his having to support me, and you know it, Susan. Well, what of it? It don't hurt him any. It hurts me, Susan. And then I think of all the things he'd hoped of me. I was going to be Jerry and Ned and myself, and I was going to make him so proud, Susan, so proud. I was going to make up to him all that he had lost. All day under the trees on top of the hill I used to lie and dream of what I was going to be some day, the great pictures I was going to paint for Dad, the great fame that was going to come to me for Dad, the money I was going to earn for Dad. I saw Dad, old and white-haired, leaning on me. I saw the old house restored, all the locks and keys and sagging blinds, the cracked ceiling and tattered wallpaper, all made fresh and new. And Dad so proud and happy in it all, so proud and happy that perhaps he'd think I really had made up for Jerry and Ned and his own lost hopes. And now look at me, useless, worse than useless, all my life a burden to him and to everybody else. Susan, I can't stand it. I can't. That's why I want to end it all. It would be so simple, such an easy way out. Yes, it would, for quitters. Quitters always take easy ways out. But you ain't no quitter, Keith Burton. Besides, 'twouldn't end it. You know that. 'Twould just be shutting the door of this room and opening the one to the next. You've had a good Christian bringing up, Keith Burton, and you know as well as I do that your eternal, immortal soul ain't going to be snuffed out of existence by no pistol shot, no matter how many times you pull the jigger.
Keith laughed, and with the laugh his tense muscles relaxed. "All right, Susan," he shrugged a little grimly. "I'll concede your point. You made it perhaps better than you know, but, well, it isn't so pleasant always to be the hook, you know," he finished bitterly. "The hook?" frowned Susan. Keith laughed again grimly. "Perhaps you've forgotten, but I haven't. I heard you talking to Mrs. McGuire one day. You said that everybody was either a hook or an eye, and that more than half the folks were hooks hanging on to somebody else, and that's why some eyes had more than their share of hooks hanging on to them. You see, I remember. I knew then, when you said it, that I was a hook, and—"
"Keith Burton, I never thought of you when I said that," interrupted Susan agitatedly.
"Perhaps not, but I did. Why, Susan, of course I'm a hook. An old, bent, rusty hook. But I can hang on. Oh, yes, I can hang on to anybody that will let me. But, Susan, don't you see? Sometimes it seems as if I'd give the whole world if just for once I could feel that someone was hanging on to me, that I was of some use somewhere."
"And so you're going to be, honey. I know you be," urged Susan eagerly. "Just remember all them fellers that wrote books and give lecturing and—"
"Oh, yes, I know," interposed Keith with a faint smile. "You were a good old soul, Susan, to read me all those charming tales, and I understood, of course, what you were doing it for. You wanted me to go and do likewise. But I couldn't write a book to save my soul, Susan, and my voice would stick in my throat at the second word of lecturing."
"But there'll be something, Keith. I know there'll be something. God never locked up the doors of your eyes without giving you the key to some other door, and just that you hadn't found it yet."
"Perhaps. I certainly haven't found it, that's sure," retorted the lad bitterly. "And just why he saw fit to send me this blindness—"
"We don't have to know," interposed Susan quickly. "And questioning about it don't settle nothing anyhow. If we've got it, we've got it, and if it's something we can possibly help, the only questioning worth anything then is how we're going to stand it. You see, there's more than one way of standing things."
"Yes, I know there is." Keith stirred restlessly in his seat.
"And some ways is better than others."
There, there, Susan, I know just what you're going to say, and it's all very true, of course," cried Keith, stirring still more restlessly. "But you see, I don't happen to feel like hearing it just now.
Oh, yes, I know I've got lots to be thankful for. I can hear and feel and taste and walk, and I should be glad for all of them. And I am, of course. I should declare that all is well with the world, and that both sides of the street are sunny, and that there isn't any shadow anywhere. There, you see, I know all that you would say, Susan, and I've said it, so as to save you the trouble. "Humph," commented Susan, bridling a little. Then suddenly she gave a sly chuckle. "That's all very well and good, Master Keith Burton, but there's one thing I would have said if I was doing the sayin'." "Well?" "About that both sides of the street bein' sunny. Seems to me that the man that says yes, he knows one side is shady and troublous, but that he thinks it'll be healthier and happier for him and everybody else walkin' round him if he walks on the sunny side, and then walks there. Seems to me he's got the spots all knocked off that feller that says there ain't no shady side." Keith gave a low laugh, a laugh more nearly normal than Susan had heard him give for several days. "All right, Susan, I'll accept your amendment, and we'll let it go at that. One side is shady, and that I'm supposed to determinedly pick the sunny side. Anything more?" "More?" "That you came up to say to me. Yes, you know. I've just saved you the trouble of saying part of it."
"Oh!" Susan laughed light-heartedly. This was Keith, her Keith that she knew. "No, that's all. She stopped short in dismay. All the color and lightness disappeared from her face, leaving it suddenly white and drawn. "That is," she faltered, "there was something else I was going to say about John McGuire.
"I don't care to hear it." Keith had frozen instantly into frigid aloofness. Stern lines had come to his boyish mouth.
But Keith, Miss McGuire came over to
read another of those precious letters, of course," cut in Keith angrily. "But I tell you I don't want to hear it. Do you suppose a caged bird likes to hear of the woods and the fields and the treetops while he's tied to a 3-inch swing between two gilt bars? Well, hardly. There's lots that I have to stand, Susan, but I don't have to stand that." Susan caught her breath with half a sob.
"But, Keith, I wasn't going to tell you of woods and fields and treetops this time. You see, now he's in a cage himself."
"What do you mean?"
"He's coming home. He's blind."
Keith leaped from his chair. "Blind? John McGuire?"
"Yes."
"Oh!"
Long years of past suffering and future woe filled the short little word to bursting as Keith dropped back into his chair. For a moment he sat silent, his whole self held rigid. Then, unsteadily, he asked the question, "What happened?" "They don't know. It was a dispatch that came this morning. He was blind, and he's on his way home, that's all."
"That's enough."
"Yes, I knew you'd understand."
"Yes, I do understand."
Susan hesitated. Keith still sat with his unseeing gaze straight ahead, his body tense and motionless. On the desk within reach lay the revolver. Cautiously Susan half extended her hand toward it, then drew it back. She glanced again at Keith's absorbed face, and then turned and made her way quietly down the stairs. At the bottom of the attic flight she glanced back. "He won't touch it now, I'm sure," she breathed. "And anyhow, we only take knives and poisons away from children, not grown men." End of chapter 23. Recording by Sunny. Chapter 24 of Dawn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sunny. Dawn by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 24. As Susan Saw It. It was the town talk, of course, the homecoming of John McGuire. Men gathered on street corners and women clustered about backyard fences and church doorways. Children besieged their parents with breathless questions and repeated to each other in awe-struck whispers what they had heard. Everywhere was horror, sympathy, and interested speculation as to how he'd take it. Where explicit information was so lacking, imagination and surmise eagerly supplied the details, and Mrs. McGuire's news of the blinding of John McGuire was not 3 days old before a full account of the tragedy from the beginning to end was flying from tongue to tongue, an account that would have surprised no one so greatly as it would have surprised John McGuire himself. To Susan, Dorothy Parkman came one day with this story.
"Well, it ain't true,"
disavowed Susan succinctly when the lurid details had been breathlessly repeated to her. "You mean he isn't blind?" demanded the young girl.
"Oh, yes, he's blind all right, poor boy. But it's the rest I mean, about his killin' 28 Germans single-handed and bein' all shot to pieces hisself, and benighted for bravery."
"But what did happen?"
"We don't know. We jest know he's blind and comin' home. Miss McGuire had 2 letters yesterday from John, but—"
"From John himself?"
"Yes, but they was both writ long before the atostrophe, an' 'course they didn't say nothin' about it. He was well and happy, he said. She'd had only 1 letter before these for a long time, and now to have this."
"Yes, I know. It's terrible. How does Mr. Keith take it?" Susan opened wide her eyes.
"Why, you've seen him. You seen him yesterday yourself, Miss Dorothy."
"Oh, I saw him in a way, but not the real him, Susan. He's miles away now, always."
"You mean he ain't civil and polite?"
demanded Susan. "Oh, he's very civil. Too civil, Susan. Every time I go, I say I won't go again. Then, when I get to thinking of him sitting there alone all day, and of how he used to like to have me read to him and play with him, I just have to go and see if he won't be the same as he used to be. But he never is."
"I know," Susan shook her head mournfully. "An' he ain't the same, Miss Dorothy. He don't ever whistle nor sing now, nor play solitary, nor any of them things he used to do. Oh, when folks comes in he braces back an' talks an' laughs. You know that. But in the exclusion of his own home, here he just sits an' thinks an' thinks an' thinks. An' Miss Dorothy, I found out now what he's thinkin' of."
"Yes?"
"It's John McGuire an' them other soldiers that's comin' back blind from the war. An' he talks an' talks about 'em an' mourns an' takes on something dreadful. He says he knows what it means, an' that nobody can know that hadn't had it happen to them. An' he broods an' broods over it."
"I can imagine it," the girl said, with a little catch in her voice.
"An' there's something else I want to tell you about. I've got to tell somebody. I want to know if you think I done right, an' you're the only one I can tell. I've thought it all out. Daniel Burton is too near, an' Miss McGuire an' all them others is too far. You ain't a relation, an' yet you care. You do care, don't you, about Mr. Keith?"
"Why, of course I care a great deal, Susan." Miss Dorothy spoke very lightly, very impersonally, but there was a sudden flame of color in her face. Susan, however, was not noticing this. Furtively she was glancing one way and another over her shoulder.
"Yes. Well, the other day he tried to, that is, well, I found him with a pistol in his hand, and—"
"Susan!" The girl had gone very white.
"Oh, he didn't do it. Well, that ain't a very sensitive statement, is it?
For if he had done it, he wouldn't be alive now, would he?" broke off Susan with a faint smile.
"But what I mean is, he didn't do it, and I don't think he's going to do it."
"But, oh, Susan," faltered the girl, "you didn't leave that awful thing with him, did you? Didn't you take it away?"
"No." Susan's mouth set grimly. "And that's what I wanted to ask you about, if I did right, you know."
"Oh, no, Susan, I'm afraid," shuddered the girl. "Can't you get it away now?"
"Maybe. I know where 'tis. I was up there yesterday and seen it. 'Twas in the desk drawer in the attic, just where it used to be."
"Then get it, Susan, get it. Oh, please get it," begged the girl. "I'm afraid to have it there a single minute."
"But, Miss Dorothy, stop. Wait just a minute. think. How's he going to get self-defiance and make a strong man of himself if we take things away from him like he was a little baby?
I know, Susan, but if he should be tempted.
He won't. He ain't no more. I'm sure of that. I talked with him. Besides, I ain't caught him up there once since that day last week. Oh, I'm free to confess I have watched him, admitted Susan defensively, with a faint smile.
But what did happen that day you found him?
Oh, he had it, handling it, and when he heard me, he jumped a little and hid it under some papers. My, Miss Dorothy, it was awful. I was that scared and frightened I thought I couldn't move. But I knew I'd got to, and I knew I'd got to move right, too, or I'd spoil everything. This wasn't no 10-cent melody drama down the movies, but I had a humane soul there before me, and I knew maybe its whole internal salvation might depend on what I said and did.
But what did you say?
I don't know. I only know that somehow, when it was over, I had a feeling that he wouldn't never do that thing again. And somehow the man in him was on top, and would stay on top. And I'm more sure than ever of it now. He ain't thinking of himself these days. It's John McGuire and them others. And ain't it better that he lets that pistol alone of his own free will and accordance, and know he was a man and no baby, than if I'd taken it away from him?
I suppose it was, Susan, but I don't think I'd have been strong enough to make him strong.
Yes, you would, if you'd been there. I reckon we're all going to learn to do a lot of things we never did before, now that the war has come.
Yes, I know. A quivering pain swept across the young girl's face.
Somehow the war never seemed real to me before. 'Twas just something way off. A lot of Dagos and Dutchmen, like the men that dug up the McGuire's frozen water pipes last spring, fighting. Not our kind of folks that talked English. Even when I read the papers and the awful things they did over there, it didn't seem as if 'twas folks on our earth. It was like something you read about in them old historic days, or something happening up on the moon or on a plantation of Mars. Oh, of course, I knew John McGuire had gone, but somehow I never thought of him as fighting, not with guns and bloody gore, in spite of them letters of his. Some way, in my mind's eye, I always see him marching with his flags flying and folks cheering, and I thought the war'd be over, anyhow, by the time he got there. But now, why, now they're all gone. Our own Teddy Summers and Tom Spencer and little Jackie Green that I used to hold on my knee. Some of 'em in France, and some of 'em in the army canteens down to Ayer and Texas and everywhere. And poor Tom's died already of pneumonia right here in our own land. And now poor John McGuire, I'll tell you, Miss Dorothy, it brings it right home now to your own heart where it hurts.
It certainly does, Susan.
And let me tell you, what do you s'pose, more'n anything else, made me see how really big it all is?
I don't know, Susan.
Well, I'll tell you. 'Twas because I couldn't write a poem on it.
Sure enough, Susan. I don't believe I've heard you make a rhyme today, smiled Miss Dorothy. Susan sighed and shook her head.
Yes, I know. I don't make 'em much now. Somehow they don't sing all the time in my heart and burst out natural like as they used to. I think them days when I tried so hard to sell my poems and couldn't, kinder took the jest out of poetsin' for me. Somehow, when you find out something is invaluable to other folks, it gets so it's invaluable to you, I s'pose. Still, even now, when I set right down to it, I can most always write 'em, right off most as quick as I used to, but I couldn't on this war. I tried, but it just wouldn't do. I begun it. Oh, woe is me, said the bayonet. Oh, woe is me, said the sword. Then the whole awful frightfulness of it and the bigness of it seemed to swallow me up, and I felt like a little pigment overtopped and surrounded by great tall mountains of horror that were tumbling down one after another on my head and bearing me
down so far and deep that I couldn't say anything, only to moan, "Oh, Lord, how long? Oh, Lord, how long?" And I knew that was too big for me. I didn't try to write no more. "I can see how you couldn't," faltered the girl as she turned away. "I'm afraid we're all going to find it too big for us." End of chapter 24. Recording by Sunny. Chapter 25 of Dawn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sunny. Dawn by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 25. Keith to the Rescue. John McGuire had not been home 24 hours before it was known that he took it powerful hard. To Keith, Susan told what she had learned. "They say he utterly refuses to see anyone outside the family, and that he'd rather not see even his own folks, that he's always asking 'em to let him alone." "Is he ill or wounded otherwise?" asked Keith. "No, he ain't hurt outwardly or infernally, except his eyes, and he says that it's the worst of it. One woman told me he's as sound as a nut and good for 100 years yet. If he'd only been smashed up good and solid, so he'd have some hope of dying pretty quick, he wouldn't mind it, he says. But to live long like this, oh, he's in an awful state of mind, everybody says." "I can imagine it," sighed Keith, and by the way he turned, Susan knew that he did not care to talk any more. An hour later Mrs. McGuire hurried into Susan's kitchen. Mrs. McGuire was looking thin and worn these days. From her half-buttoned shoes to her half-combed hair, she was showing the results of strain and anxiety. With a long sigh she dropped into one of the kitchen chairs. "Well, Miss McGuire, if you ain't the stranger!" Susan greeted her cordially. "Yes, I know," sighed Mrs. McGuire. "But you see, I can't leave him." As she spoke she looked anxiously through the window towards her own door. "Mr. McGuire's with him now, so I got away." "But there's Bess and Harry," began Susan. "We don't leave him with the children, ever," interposed Mrs. McGuire with another hurried glance through the window. "We don't care to. You see, once we found him with his father's old pistol. Oh, Susan, it was awful." "Yes, it must have been." Susan, after one swift glance into her visitor's face, had turned her back suddenly. She was busy now with the dampers of her kitchen stove. "Oh, of course we took it right away," went on Mrs. McGuire, "and put it where he'll never get it again. But we're always afraid there'll be something somewhere that he will get a hold of. You see, he's so despondent, in such a terrible state." "Yes, I know," nodded Susan. Susan had abandoned her dampers and had turned right about face again. "If only he'd see folks now." "Yes, and that's why I came over to talk to you about," cried Mrs. McGuire eagerly. "We haven't been able to get him to see anybody, not anybody. But I've been wondering if he wouldn't see Keith, if we could work it right. You see, he says he just won't be stared at. And Keith, poor boy, couldn't stare, and John knows it. Oh, Susan, do you s'pose we could manage it?" "Why, of course. I'll tell him right away, and he'll go over. I know he'll go," exclaimed Susan, all interest at once. "Oh, but that wouldn't do at all," cried Mrs. McGuire. "Don't you see? John refuses, absolutely refuses to see anyone, and he wouldn't see Keith if I should ask him to. But he's interested in Keith. I know he's that. For once, when I was talking to Mr. McGuire about Keith, John broke in and asked 2 or 3 questions, and he's never done that before about anybody. So I was pretty sure it was because Keith was blind, you know, like himself." Yes, I see. "And if I can only manage it so they'll meet without John's knowing they're going to, I believe he'll get to talking with him before he knows it, and that it'll do him a world of good. Anyway, something's got to be done, Susan. It's got to be, to get him out of this awful state he's in.
Well, we'll do it. I know we can do it some way.
You think Keith'll do his part? Mrs. McGuire's eyes were anxious.
I'm sure he will, when he understands.
Then listen, proposed Mrs. McGuire eagerly. I'll get my John out on the back porch tomorrow morning. That's the only place outdoors I can get him, and he can't be seen from the street there, you know. I'll get him there as near 10 o'clock as I can. You be on the watch, and as soon as I get him all nicely fixed, you get Keith to come out into your yard and stroll over to the fence and speak to him, and then come up on the porch and sit down just naturally. He can do that all right, can't he? It's just wonderful, the way he gets around everywhere with that little cane of his.
Yes, oh yes.
Well, I thought he could. And tell him to keep right on talking every minute, so my John won't have a chance to get up and go in the house. Of course, I shall be there myself at first. We never leave him alone, you know. But as soon as Keith comes, I shall go. They'll get along better by themselves, I'm sure. Only, of course, I shall be where I can keep a watch out of the window. Now do you understand?
Yes, and we can do it. I know we can do it.
All right, then. I'm not so sure we can, but we'll try it anyway, sighed Mrs. McGuire, rising to her feet, the old worry back on her face. Well, I must be going. Mr. McGuire'll have a fit. He's as nervous as a witch when he's left alone with John. There, what did I tell you? She broke off with an expressive gesture and a glance as a careworn-looking man appeared in the doorway of the house across the 2 back yards, and peered anxiously over the Burtons' kitchen door. Now don't forget, 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
I won't forget, promised Susan cheerfully.
Now, do you go home and set easy, Miss McGuire, and don't you fret no more. It's coming out all right, I tell you, she reiterated as Mrs. McGuire hurried through the doorway. But when Mrs. McGuire was gone, Susan drew a dubious sigh, and her cheery smile had turned to a questioning frown as she went in search of Keith. Very evidently, Susan was far from feeling quite so sure about Keith's cooperation as she would have Mrs. McGuire think. Keith was in the living room, his head bowed into his 2 hands, his elbows on the table before him. At the first sound of Susan's steps he lifted his head with a jerk.
"I was looking for you," began
Susan the moment she had crossed the threshold. Susan had learned that Keith hated above all things to have to speak first or to ask, "Who is it?"
"Mrs. McGuire's just been here."
"Yes, I heard her voice," returned the boy indifferently.
"She was telling about her John."
"How's he getting along?"
"He's in a bad way. Oh, he's really well physically, but he's in a bad way in his mind."
"Well, you don't wonder, do you?"
"Oh, no, 'course not. Still, well, for one thing, he don't like to see folks."
"Strange, now. I'd think he'd just dote on seeing folks, wouldn't you?" Susan caught the full force of the sarcasm, but superbly she ignored it.
"Well, I don't know. Maybe, but anyhow, he don't, and Miss McGuire's that worried that she don't know what to do. You see, she found him once with his daddy's pistol."
Susan was talking very fast now.
"And 'course that worked her up something terrible. I'm afraid he ain't got much backbone. They don't dare to leave him alone a minute, not a minute. And Miss McGuire, she was wondering if you could help him out some way."
"I?" The short ejaculation was full of amazement.
"Yes, that's what she come over for this morning."
"I? They forget." Keith fell back bitterly. "John McGuire might get hold of a dozen revolvers, and I wouldn't know it."
"Oh, 'twasn't that. They don't want you to watch him. They wanted you to. Well, 'tis just this. Miss McGuire thought as how if she could get her John out on the back porch, and you happened to be in our backyard, and should go over and speak to him, maybe you could get to talking with him and go up and sit. She thought maybe 'twould get him out of hisself that way. You see, he won't talk to most folks. He don't like to be stared at."
Susan threw a furtive glance into Keith's face, then looked quickly away.
"But she thought maybe he would talk to you." "Yes, I see." Keith drew in his breath with a little catch.
"And so she said there wasn't anybody anywhere that could help so much as you, if you would."
"Why, of course, if I really could help."
Susan did not need to look into Keith's face to catch the longing and heart hunger and dawning hope in the word left suspended on his lips. She felt her own throat tighten, but in a moment she managed to speak with steady cheerfulness. "Well, you can. You can help a whole lot. I'm sure you can. And Miss McGuire is, too. And what's more, you're the only one that can help 'em in this case. So we'll keep watching to-morrow morning, and when it comes out to the porch, well, we'll see what we will see." And Susan, just as if her own heart was not singing a triumphant echo of the song she knew was in his, turned away with an elaborate air of indifference. Yet when tomorrow came, and when Keith went out into the yard in response to the presence of John McGuire on his back porch, the result was most disappointing to Susan. To Keith it did not seem so much so. But perhaps Keith had not expected quite what Susan had expected. At all events, Keith came back to the house with a glow on his face and a springiness in his step that Susan had not seen there for months. Yet all that happened was that Keith had called out from the gate a pleasant "good morning" to the blinded soldier, and had followed it with an inconsequential word or two about the weather. John McGuire had answered a crisp, cold something, and had risen at once to go into the house. Keith, at the first sound of his feet on the porch floor, had turned with a cheery, "Well, I must be going back into the house," whereupon John McGuire had sat down again, and Mrs. McGuire, who at Keith's first words had started to her feet, dropped back into her chair. Apparently not much accomplished, certainly. Yet there was a glow on Keith's face, and the springiness in Keith's step, and when he reached the kitchen he said this to Susan: "The next time John McGuire's out on the back porch, please let me know." And Susan let him know, both then and the subsequent times. It was a pretty game, and one well worth the watching. Certainly Susan and Mrs. McGuire thought it so. On the other side were the persistence and the perseverance and infinite tact. On the other were distrustful antagonism and palpable longing for an understanding companionship. At first the intercourse between the two blind youths consisted of a mere word or two tossed by Keith to the other, who gave still a shorter word in reply. And even this was not every day, for John McGuire was not out on the porch every day. But as the month passed, he came more and more frequently, and one evening Mrs. McGuire confided to Susan the fact that John seemed actually to fret now if a storm kept him indoors. "And he listens for Keith to come along the fence. I know he does," she still further declared. "Oh, I know he doesn't let him say much yet, but he hasn't jumped up to go into the house once since those first 2 or 3 times, and that's something. And what's more, he let Keith stay a whole minute at the gate talking yesterday," she finished in triumph. "Yes, and the best of it is," chimed Susan, "it's helping Keith Burton hisself just as much as John McGuire. Why, he ain't the same boy since he took to trying to get your John to talking, and he asks me a dozen times a morning if John's out on the porch yet. And when he is out there, he don't lose no time a going out hisself." Yet it was the very next morning that Keith, after eagerly asking if John McGuire were back on the porch, did not go out. Instead, he settled back in his chair and picked up one of his embossed books. Susan frowned in amazed wonder, and opened her lips as if to speak, but after a glance at Keith's apparently absorbed face, she turned and went back to her work in the kitchen. Twice during the next 10 minutes, however, she invented an excuse to pass again through the living room where Keith sat. Yet, though she said and pointed something each time about John McGuire on the back porch, Keith did not respond save with an indifferent word or two. And, greatly to her indignation, he was still sitting in his chair with his book when at noon John McGuire, on the porch across the back yard, rose from his seat and went into the house. Susan was still more indignant when, the next morning, the same program was repeated, except for the fact that Susan's reminders of John McGuire's presence on the back porch were even more pointed than they had been the day before. Again, the third morning, it was the same. Susan resolved then to speak. She said to herself that patience had ceased to be virtuous, and she lay awake half that night rehearsing a series of arguments and pleadings which she meant to present the next morning. She was the more incited to this owing to Mrs. McGuire's distracted reproaches the evening before. "Why, John has asked for him, actually asked for him," Mrs. McGuire had wept. "And it is cruel, the cruelest thing I ever saw, to get that poor boy all worked up to the point of really wanting to talk with him, and then stay away 3 whole days like this." On the 4th morning, therefore, when John McGuire appeared on the back porch, Susan went into the Burton living room with an avowed determination of getting Keith out of the house and into the back yard, or of telling him exactly what she thought of him. She had all of her elaborate scheming for nothing, however, for at her first terse announcement that John McGuire was on the back porch, Keith sprang to his feet with a cheery, "So, well, I guess I'll go out myself," and Susan was left staring at him with open eyes and mouth, yet not too dazed to run to the open window and watch what happened. And this is what Susan saw and heard. Keith, with his almost uncannily skillful stick to guide him, sauntered down the path and called a cheery greeting to John McGuire. John McGuire, who, in his eagerness to respond, leaned away forward in his chair with a sudden flame of color on his face. Keith still sauntered toward the dividing fence, pausing only to feel with his fingers and pick the one belated rose from the bush at the gate. He pushed the gate open then, still talking cheerfully, and the next moment Susan was holding her breath, for Keith had gone straight up the walk, up the steps, and had dropped himself into the vacant chair beside John McGuire. And John McGuire, after a faint start as if to rise, had fallen back in his seat, and had turned his face uncertainly, fearfully, yet with infinite longing toward the blind youth at his side. Susan looked then at Mrs. McGuire. Mrs. McGuire, too, was plainly holding her breath, suspended. On her face, too, were uncertainty, fearfulness, and infinite longing. For a moment she watched the 2 boys intently. Then she rose and with cautious steps made her way into the house. After supper that night she came over and told Susan all about it. Her face was beaming. "Did you see them?" she began breathlessly. "Wasn't it wonderful? A whole half hour those 2 blessed boys sat there and talked. And John laughed twice, actually laughed." "Yes, I know," Susan nodded, her own face no less beaming. "And to think how just last night I was scolding and blaming Keith because he didn't come over these last 3 days, and I never saw at all what he was up to." "Up to?" frowned Susan. Yes, don't you see? He did it on purpose. Stayed away 3 whole days so John would miss him and want him. And John did miss him. Why, he listened for him all the time. I could just see he was listening. And that's what made me so angry, because Keith didn't come. The idea! My boy wanting something and that somebody not there. But I know now. I understand. And I love him for it. He did it to make him want him. And it worked. Why, if he'd come before every day just as usual, John wouldn't have talked with him. And I know he wouldn't. But now, oh, Susan, it was wonderful, wonderful. I watched him from the window. I had to watch. I was afraid still. And of course I heard some things. And oh, Susan, it was wonderful, the way the boy understood. You mean Keith? Yes. You see, first John began to talk just as he talked with us, raving because he's so strong and well and likely to live to be 100, and if how he'll look one of these days with his little tin cup held out for pennies and his sign, "Please help the blind," and of what he's got to look forward to all his life. Oh, Susan, it's enough to break a heart of a stone when he talks like that. Susan drew in her breath. You don't suppose I know? Well, I guess I do. But what did Keith say to him? Nothing. And that was the first wonderful thing. You see, we always talk and try to comfort him when he talks like that. But Keith didn't. He just let him talk, with nothing but just a sympathetic word now and then. But it wasn't long before I noticed a wonderful thing was happening.
Keith was beginning to talk, not about that awful tin cup and the pennies and the sign, but about other things. First about the rose in his hand, and pretty quick John was talking about it too. He had the rose and was smelling of it. Then Keith had a new knife, and he passed that over, and pretty quick I saw that John had that little link puzzle of Keith's, and was having a great time trying to straighten it out. That's the first time I heard him laugh. I began to realize what Keith was doing. He was filling John's mind full of something else besides himself for just a minute, and was showing him that there were things he could call by name, like the rose and the knife and the puzzle, even if he couldn't see 'em. Oh, Keith didn't say anything like that to him, trust him for that, but before John knew it, he was doing it, calling things by name, I mean. And Keith is coming again tomorrow. John told me so, and if you could have seen his face when he said it. Oh, Susan, isn't it wonderful? She finished fervently as she turned to go. It is indeed wonderful, murmured Susan. But Susan's eyes were out the window on Keith's face. Keith and his father were coming up the walk talking, and on Keith's face was a light Susan had never seen there before. End of chapter 25. Recording by Sunny. Chapter 26 of Dawn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sunny. Dawn by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 26. Maisie Again. It came to be the accepted thing almost at once, then, that Keith Burton and John McGuire should spend their mornings together on the McGuires' back porch. In less than a fortnight young McGuire even crossed the yard arm in arm with Keith to the Burtons' back porch and sat there one morning. After that it was only a question as to which porch it should be. That it would be one of them was a foregone conclusion. Sometimes the two boys talked together. Sometimes they worked on one of Keith's raised picture puzzles. Sometimes Keith read aloud from one of his books. Whatever they did, their doing it was the great source of interest to the entire neighborhood. Not only did Mrs. McGuire and Susan breathlessly watch from their respective kitchens, but friends and neighbors fabricated excuses to come to the two houses in order to see for themselves. Children gathered along the divisional fence and gazed with round eyes of wonder. But they gazed silently. Everybody gazed silently. Even the children seemed to understand that the one unpardonable sin was to let the blind boys on the porch know that they were the objects of any sort of interest. One day Maisie Sanborn came. She brought a new book for Mrs. McGuire to read, an attention she certainly had never before bestowed on John McGuire's mother. She talked 1/2 minute about the book and 5 minutes about the beautiful new friendship between the two blind young men. She insisted on going into the kitchen where she could see the two boys on the porch. Then, before Mrs. McGuire could divine her purpose and stop her, she had slipped through the door and out onto the porch itself. "How do you do, gentlemen?" she began blithely. But the terrified Mrs. McGuire had her by the arm and was pulling her back into the kitchen before she could finish her sentence. On the porch the two boys had leapt to their feet, John McGuire in particular looking distressed and angry. "Who was that? Is anybody there?" he demanded. "No, dear, not now." In the doorway Mrs. McGuire was trying to nod assurance to the boys and frowned banishment to Maisie Sanborn at the same moment. "But there was someone," insisted her son sharply. "Just someone that brought the book for me to read, dearie, and she's gone now." Frantically Mrs. McGuire was motioning Maisie to make her assertion the truth. John McGuire sat down then. So, too, did Keith. But all the rest of the morning John was nervously alert for all sounds, and his ears were frequently turned toward the kitchen door. He began to talk again, too, bitterly, of the little tin cup for the pennies and the sign, "Pity the Poor Blind." He lost all interest in Keith's books and puzzles, and when he was not railing of the tragedy of his fate, he was sitting in gloomy silence. Keith told Susan that afternoon that if Mrs. McGuire did not keep people away from that porch when he was out there with John, he would not answer for the consequences.
Susan told Mrs. McGuire, and Mrs. McGuire told Mazie Sanborn, at the same time returning the loaned book, all of which did not tend to smooth Miss Mazie's already ruffled feelings. To Dorothy, Mazie expressed her mind on the matter. "I don't care. I'll never go there again, never," she declared angrily, "nor speak to Mrs. McGuire, nor that precious son of hers, nor Keith Burton either, so there!" "Oh, Mazie, but poor Keith isn't to blame," remonstrated Dorothy earnestly, the color flaming into her face. "He is, too. He's just as bad as John McGuire. He jumped up and looked just as cross as John McGuire did when I went out on that porch. And he didn't ever really want to see us. You know he doesn't. He just stands us because he thinks he's got to be polite." "But, Mazie, dear, he's so sensitive, and he feels his affection keenly, and—" "Oh, yes, that's right. Stand up for him. I knew you would," snapped Mazie crossly. "And everybody knows it, too, running after him the way you do." "Running after him?" Dorothy's face was scarlet now. "Yes, running after him," reiterated the other incisively. "And you always have, trotting over there all the time with books and puzzles, candy and flowers and—" "For shame, Mazie!" interrupted Dorothy with hot indignation. "As if trying to help that poor blind boy to while away a few hours of his time were running after him. But he doesn't want you to while away an hour or two of his time, and I should think you'd see he didn't. You could if you weren't so dead in love with him and—" "Mazie!" gasped Dorothy, aghast. "Well, it's so. Anybody can see that, the way you color up every time his name is mentioned, and the way you look at him with your heart in your eyes, and—" "Mazie Sanborn!" gasped Dorothy again. Her face was not scarlet now. It had gone dead white. She was on her feet, horrified, dismayed, and very angry. "Well, I don't care. It's so. Everybody knows it. And when a fellow shows so plainly that he'd rather be let alone, how you can keep thrusting yourself—" But Dorothy had gone, with a proud lifting of her head and a sharp, "Nonsense, Mazie! You are wild. We'll not discuss it any longer, please." She had turned and left the room. But she remembered. She must have remembered, for she did not go near the Burtons' homestead for a week. Neither did the next week nor the next see her there. Furthermore, though the little stand in her room had shown 2 new picture puzzles and a new game especially designed for the blind, it displayed them no longer after those remarks of Mazie Sanborn's. Not that Keith had them, however. Indeed, no. They were buried deep under a pile of clothing in the farther corner of Dorothy's bottom bureau drawer. At the Burtons' homestead, Susan wondered a little at her absence. She even said to Keith one day, "Why, where's Dorothy? We haven't seen her for 2 weeks."
"I don't know, I'm sure."
The way Keith's lips came together over that last word caused Susan to throw a keen glance into his face. "Now, Keith, I hope you two haven't been quarreling again." She frowned anxiously.
"Again? Nonsense, Susan. We never did quarrel. Don't be silly."
The youth shifted his position uneasily.
"I'm thinkin' 'tain't always me that's silly," observed Susan, with another keen glance. "That girl was gettin' so she come over just natural like again, every little while bringin' in one thing or another. 'Twas nothin' more'n a funny story to make us laugh. And what I want to know is why she stopped right off short like this for—" "Nonsense!" tossed Keith again, with a lift of his chin. Then, with an attempt at lightness that was very near a failure, he laughed. "I reckon we don't want her to come if she doesn't want to, do we, Susan?"
"Humph!" was Susan's only comment, outwardly. Inwardly she was vowing to see that young woman and to have it out with her once and for all. But Susan did not see her nor have it out with her, for as it happened, something occurred that night so all-absorbing and exciting that even the unexplained absence of Dorothy Parkman became as nothing beside it. With the abrupt suddenness that sometimes makes the long-awaited-for event a real shock, came the news of the death of that poor old woman whose frail hand had held the wealth that Susan had coveted for Daniel Burton and his son. The 2 men left the next morning on the 400-mile journey that would take them to the town where Nancy Holworthy had lived. Scarcely had they left the house before Susan began preparations for their homecoming, as befitted their new estate. Her first move was to get out all the best silver and china.
She was busy cleaning it when Mrs. McGuire came to the kitchen door. "What's the matter?" she began breathlessly. "Where's Keith? John's been asking for him all the morning. Is Mr. Burton sick? They just telephoned from the store that Mr. Burton had sent word that he wouldn't be down for a few days. He isn't sick, is he? Or Keith? I couldn't make out quite all they'd said, but there was something about Keith. They ain't either of 'em sick, are they?" "Oh, no, they're both well, very well, thank you." There was an air, half elation, half superiority, about Susan that was vaguely irritating to Mrs. McGuire. "Well, you needn't be so secret about it, Susan," she began a little haughtily. But Susan tossed her head with a light laugh. "Secret? I guess it won't be no secret long. Mr. Daniel Burton and Master Keith have gone away, Mrs. McGuire." "Away? You mean a vacation?" frowned Mrs. McGuire doubtfully. Susan laughed again, still with that irritating air of superiority. "Well, hardly. This ain't no pleasure exertion, Miss McGuire. Still, on the other hand, Daniel Burton wouldn't be half human if he didn't get some pleasure out of it, though he wouldn't so demean himself as to show it, of course. Miss Nancy Holworthy is dead, Miss McGuire. We had this signification last night." "No, you don't mean the Nancy Holworthy, the one that's got the money?" The excited interest of Mrs. McGuire's face and voice was as great as Susan herself could have desired. Susan obviously swelled with glory of the occasion, though she still spoke with cold loftiness. "The one and the same, Miss McGuire." "My stars and stockings! You don't say! And they've gone to the funeral?" "They have." "And they'll get the money now, I suppose?" "They will." "But are you sure? You know, sometimes when folks expect the money they don't get it. It's been willed away to someone else." "Yes, I know, but won't be here," spoke Susan with decision. "Miss Holworthy couldn't if she wanted to. It's all foreordained and fixed beforehand. Daniel Burton was to get just the annual while she lived, and then the whole in a plump sum when she died. Well, she's dead, and now he gets it. And a right tidy little sum it is, too." "Was she awful rich, Susan?" "More'n 100,000. 150, I've heard say." "My gracious me! And to think of Daniel Burton having $150,000! What in the world will he do with it?" Susan's chin came up superbly. "Well, I can tell you one thing he'll do, Mrs. McGuire. He'll stop peddling peas and beans over that counter down there, and retire to a life of ease and laxity with his paint brushes as he ought to. And he'll have some fit to eat and wear, and Keith will too. And furthermore, and likewise, you'll see some differences in this place, or my name ain't Susan Betts. Them two men have got an awful lot to live up to, and I mean they shall. Understand it right away." "Which explains this array of china and silver, I take it?" observed Mrs. McGuire dryly. What?" frowned Susan doubtfully, then her face cleared. "Yes, that's just it. I've got to have things now fitted up to their new estation. We shall get more, too. We need some new teaspoons and forks, and I want 'em to get some of them bunion spoons." "Bunion spoons?" "Yes, when you eat soup out of 'em. Two-handled cups, you know. Or maybe you don't know," she corrected herself at the odd expression that had come to Mrs. McGuire's face. "But I do. Mrs. Professor Hinckley used to have 'em. They're awful pretty and stylish, too, and we've got to have a lot of other things. New china and some cut glass and—" "Well, it strikes me," interrupted Mrs. McGuire severely, "that Daniel Burton had better be putting his money into Liberty bonds and Red Cross work instead of silver spoons and cut glass in these war times, and—" "My land, Miss McGuire!" With the sudden exclamation Susan had dropped the spoon she was polishing. Her eyes, wild and incredulous, were staring straight into the startled eyes of the woman opposite. "Do you know? Since that yeller telegram came last night tellin' us Nancy Holworthy was dead, I ain't even once thought of that war." "Well, I guess you would think of it if you had my John right before you all the time." With a bitter sigh Mrs. McGuire had relaxed in her chair. "You wouldn't need anything else." "I don't need anything else with Daniel Burton round." "What do you mean?" "Why, I mean that man don't do nothin' but read war and talk war every minute he's in the house. And what with them wheatless days and meatless days, He fairly eats war. You heard my poem on them meatless, wheatless days, didn't you?"
Mrs. McGuire shook her head listlessly. Her somber eyes were on the lonely figure of her son on the porch across the 2 backyards.
"You didn't? Well, I'll say it to you then. 'Tain't much, still it's kind of good in a way. I hadn't written hardly anything lately, but I did write this: We've a wheatless day and a meatless day, and a tasteless, wasteless, sweetless day. But with never a pause, for the good of the cause, we'd even consent to an eatless day. And we would, too, of course. And as far as that's concerned, there's a good many other kinds of less days I'm thinking wouldn't hurt none of us. How about a fretless day and a worryless day? Wouldn't they be great? And only think what a talkless day'd mean in some households I could mention. Oh, of course, present company always accentuated," she hastened to add with a sly chuckle, as Mrs. McGuire stirred into a sudden resentment. "Humph!" subsided Mrs. McGuire, still a little resentfully. "And I'm free to confess that there's some kinds of less days that we've already got plenty of," went on Susan after a moment's thoughtful pause. "There's folks that take quite enough workless days and laughless days and pityless days and thankless days. My land, there ain't no end to them kind, as any one can see. And there was them heatless days last winter. I guess no one was hankerin' for more of them. Oh, of course, I understand that was just preservin' of coal, and that 'twas necessary and all that. And that's another thing, too, this preservation business. I'd like to add a few things to that and make 'em preserve in fault-finding and crossness and backbiting and gossip as well as in coal and sugar and wheat and beef." Mrs. McGuire gave a short laugh. "My goodness, Susan, if you ain't the limit, and no mistake, I suppose you mean conservation." "Huh? What's that?" "Well, conservation, then. What's the difference, anyway?" she scoffed a bit testily. Then abruptly her face changed. "But there, this ain't settlin' what I'm goin' to do with Daniel Burton," she finished with a profound sigh. "Do with him?" puzzled Mrs. McGuire. "Yes." Susan picked up the silver spoon and began indifferently to polish it. "'Tain't no use for me to be doin' all this. Daniel Burton won't know whether he's eatin' with a silver spoon or one made of pewter. No more will he retire to a life of ease and laxity with his paint brushes unless they declare peace to-morrow mornin'." "You don't mean he'll stay in the store?" Susan made a despairing gesture. "Goodness only knows what he'll do. I don't know. I know what he does now, and he's as uneasy as a fish out of water, and he roams the house from one end to the other every night after he reads the paper. He's got one of them war maps on his wall, and he keeps changin' the pins and flags, and I hear him mutterin' under his breath. You see, he has to keep it from Keith all he can, for Keith hisself feels so bad 'cause he can't be up and doin', and if he thought he was keepin' his father back from helpin', I don't know what the poor boy would do. But I think if 'twa'n't for Keith, Daniel Burton would try to enlist and go over. Oh, of course, he's beyond the malicious age, as far as bein' drafted is concerned, and you wouldn't naturally think such a mild-tempered lookin' man would go in much for killin'. But this war has stirred him up somethin' awful." "Well, who wouldn't it?" "Oh, I know that, and I ain't sayin' as how it shouldn't. But that don't make it easier for Daniel Burton to keep his feelin's hid from his son, particularly when it's that son that made him have these feelin's partly. There ain't no doubt but that one of the things that's made Daniel Burton so fidgety and uneasy and ready to just fling hisself into that ravine conflict over there is his unhappiness and disappointment over Keith. He had such big plans for that boy." "Yes, I know we all have big plans for our boys," Mrs. McGuire choked and turned away. "And girls, too, for that matter," hurried on Susan, with a quick glance into the other's face. "And speakin' of girls, did you see Hattie Turner on the street last night?" Dumbly Mrs. McGuire answered with a shake of her head. Her eyes had gone back to her son's face across the yard. "Well, I did. Heard Charlie's at Camp Devens, you know. They say he's invited to more places every Sunday than he can possibly accept, and that he's petted and praised and made of everywhere he goes, and tended right up so he won't get lonesome or attend unquestionable entertainments. Well, that's all right and good, of course, as it should be. But I wish somebody'd take up Charlie Turner's wife and invite her to Sunday dinners and take her to ride and see that she didn't attend unquestionable entertainments. Why, Susan Betts, what an idea! Protested Mrs. McGuire, suddenly sitting erect in her chair. Hattie Turner isn't fighting for her country. No, but her husband is, retorted Susan crisply. And she's fighting for her honor and her future peace and happiness, and she's doing it all alone. She's pretty as a picture and nothing but a child when he married her 4 months ago, and we've taken away her natural provider and entertainer and left her nothing but her freedom for a ballast wheel. And I say I wish some of the patriotic people who are just showering every Charlie Turner with attentions would please sprinkle just a few on Charlie's wife to help her keep her straight and sweet and honest for Charlie when he comes back.
Maybe, murmured Mrs. McGuire, rising wearily to her feet. But there ain't many that think of that.
There'll be more think of it by and by, when it's too late, observed Susan succinctly, as she too rose from her chair.
End of chapter 26. Recording by Sunny. Chapter 27 of Dawn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sunny. Dawn by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 27. For the Sake of John. In due course Daniel Burton and his son Keith returned from the funeral of their kinswoman, Mrs. Nancy Holworthy. The town, aware now of the stupendous change that had come to the fortunes of the Burton family, stared, gossiped, shook wise heads of prophecy, then passed on to the next sensation, which happened to be the return of 4 soldiers from across the seas, 3 crippled, 1 blinded. At the Burton homestead the changes did not seem so stupendous after all. True, Daniel Burton had abandoned the peddling of peas and beans across the counter, and had, at the earnest solicitation of his son, got out his easel and placed a fresh canvas upon it. But he obviously worked half-heartedly, and he still roamed the house after reading the evening paper, and spent even more time before the great war map on his studio wall. True, also, disgruntled tradesmen no longer rang peremptory peals on the doorbell, and the postman's load of bills on the first of the month was perceptibly decreased. The dinner table, too, bore evidence that a scanty purse no longer controlled the larder, but no new china or cut glass graced the board. And Susan's longed-for bouillon spoons had never materialized. Locks and doors and sagging blinds had received prompt attention, and already the house was being prepared for a new coat of paint. But no startling alterations or improvements were promised by the evidence, and Keith was still to be seen almost daily on the McGuire back porch, as before, or on his own with John McGuire. It is no wonder, surely, that very soon the town ceased to stare and gossip, or even to shake wise heads of prophecy. Nancy Holworthy's death was 2 months in the past, when one day Keith came home from John McGuire's back porch in evident excitement and agitation.
"Why, Keith, what's the matter? What is the matter?" demanded Susan concernedly.
"Nothing, that is, I don't know. I acted as if anything was the matter," stammered the youth.
"Well, you do. Now tell me, what is it?"
Nothing, Susan, nothing you can help." Keith was pacing back and forth and up and down the living room, not even using his cane to define the familiar limits of his pathway. Suddenly he turned and stopped short, his whole body quivering with emotion. "Susan, I can't stand it," he moaned.
"I know, Keith, but what is it now?"
"John McGuire. He's been telling me how it is over there.
Why, Susan, I could see it, I tell you, and oh, I did so want to be there to help. He told me how they held it, the little clump of trees. It meant so much to us. And now, one by one, they fell, those brave fellows with them. I could see it, I could hear it. I could hear the horrid din of the guns and shells, and the crash of fallen trees about us, and the shouts and groans of the men at our side. And they needed men, more men, to take the place of those that had fallen. Even one man counted there, counted for, oh, so much.
For at the last there was just one man left, John McGuire, and to hear him tell it, it was wonderful, wonderful. I know, nodded Susan. It was like his letters. You could see things. He made you see 'em. And that's what he always did, made you see things, even when he was a little boy. His mother told me. He wanted to write, you know. He was going to be a writer before this happened. And now the sentence trailed off into silence, unfinished. And to think of all that day being wasted on a blind baby tied to a picture puzzle, moaned Keith, resuming his nervous pacing of the room. If only a man, a real man, can have heard him, one that could go and do a man's work. Why, Susan, that story he told would make a stone fight. I never heard anything like it. I never supposed there could be anything like that battle. He never talked like this until today. Oh, he's told me a little from time to time, but today he just poured his heart out to me. And there are so many who need just that message to stir them from their smug complacency. Men who could fight and win, men who would fight and win, if only they could see and hear and know as I saw and heard and knew this afternoon. And there it was, wasted, worse than wasted on me. Chokingly, Keith turned away, but with a sudden cry, Susan caught his arm. No, Keith, it wasn't wasted. You mustn't let it be wasted, she panted. Listen, you want others to hear it, what you heard, don't you? Why, yes, Susan, but then make 'em hear it, she interrupted. You can. How? Make him write it down, just as he talks. He wants to. He's always wanted to. Then publish it in a book so everyone can see it and hear it, as you did. Oh, Susan, if we only could. A dawning hope had come into Keith Burton's face, but almost at once it faded into gray disappointment. We couldn't do it, though, Susan. He couldn't do it. You know, he can't write at all. He's only begun to practice a little bit. He'd never get it down with the fire and the vim in it, learning to write as he'd have to. What do you suppose Lincoln's Gettysburg speech would have been if he had to stop and learn how to spell to write each word before he could put it down? I know, nodded Susan. It's that way with me and my poetry. I just have to get it right ahead while the fuse burns and spell 'em somehow, anyhow, so to get 'em down while I'm in the fit of it. He couldn't do it. I can see that now. But, Keith, couldn't you do it? Take it down, I mean, as he talked, like a stylographer? Keith shook his head. I wish I could, but I couldn't. I know I couldn't. I couldn't begin to do it fast enough to keep up with him, and 'twould spoil it all to ask him to slow down. When a man's got a couple of Huns coming straight for him, and he knows he's got to get 'em both at once, you can't very well sing out, Here, wait a minute, I'll get that last sentence down. I know, nodded Susan again. She paused, drew a long sigh, and turned her eyes out the window. Up the walk was coming Daniel Burton. His step was slow, his head was bowed. He looked like anything but the happy possessor of new wealth. Susan frowned as she watched him. I wish your father, she began. Suddenly she stopped. A new light had leapt into her eyes. Keith, she cried eagerly. I have it. Your father. He could do it. I know he could. Do what? Take down John McGuire's story. Couldn't he do it? Why, yes, he could, I think, hesitated Keith doubtfully. He doesn't know shorthand, but he's got eyes. Keith's voice broke a little. And he could see what he was doing, and he could take down enough so he could patch it up afterwards, I'm sure. But, Susan, John McGuire wouldn't tell it to him. Don't you see? He won't even see anybody but me, and he didn't talk like this even to me until today. How's Dad going to hear it to write it down? Tell me that. But he could overhear it, Keith. No, don't look like that, she protested hurriedly, as Keith began to frown. Just listen a minute. It would be just as easy.
he could be over on the grass right close where he could hear every word, and you could get John to talking, and as soon as he got really started on a story, your father could begin to write it, and John wouldn't know a thing about it, and—"
"Yes, you're quite right. John wouldn't know a thing about it," broke in Keith, with a passion so sudden and bitter that Susan fell back in dismay.
"Why, Keith!"
she exclaimed, her startled eyes on his quivering face. "I wonder if you think I'd do it?" he demanded. "I wonder if you really think I'd cheat that poor fellow into talking to me just because he hadn't had eyes to see that I wasn't the only one in his audience?"
"But, Keith, he wouldn't mind. He wouldn't mind a bit," urged Susan, "if he didn't know, and—"
"Oh, no, he wouldn't mind being cheated and deceived and made a fool of just because he couldn't see."
"No, he wouldn't mind," persisted Susan stoutly. "It wouldn't be mean listenin' nor sneakin' listenin'. It wouldn't be listenin' to things he didn't want us to hear. He'd be glad after it was all done, and—"
"Would he?" choked Keith still more bitterly. "Maybe you think I was glad after it was all done and I found I'd been fooled and cheated into thinking the girl that was reading and talking to me and playing games with me was a girl I'd never known before, a girl who was what she pretended to be, a new friend doing it all because she wanted to, because she liked to."
"But, Keith, I'm sure that Dorothy liked—"
There, Susan," interposed Keith, with a quick uplifted hand. "We'll not discuss it, please. Yes, I know. I began the subject myself, and it was my fault. But when I heard you say John McGuire would be glad when he found out how we'd lied to his poor blind eyes, I just couldn't hold it in. I had to say something. But never mind that now, Susan. Only you'll have to understand I mean what I say. There's no letting Dad copy his story on the sly."
"But there's a way. There must be a way," urged Susan feverishly. "Only think what it would mean to that boy if we could get him started to writing books that he'd been wanting to do all his life. Oh, Keith, why, he'd even forget his eyes then."
"It would help some." Keith drew in his breath and held it a moment suspended. "And he'd even be helping us to win out over there. For if we could get that story of his on paper as he told it to me, the fellow that reads it wouldn't need any recruiting station to send him over there. If there was only a way that Father could—"
"There is, and we'll find it," interposed Susan eagerly. "I know we will. And, Keith, it's goin' to be 'most as good for him as it is for John McGuire. He's nervous as a witch since he quit his job."
"I know." A swift cloud crossed the boy's face. "But it wasn't giving up his job that made him nervous, Susan, as you and I both know very well. However, we'll see. And you may be sure if there's a way, I'll find it, Susan," he finished a bit wearily as he turned to go upstairs. End of chapter 27. Recording by Sunny. Chapter 28 of Dawn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sunny. Dawn by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 28. The Way. Keith was still looking for the way when October came, bringing crisp days and chilly winds. When not too cold, the boys still sat out of doors. When it was too cold, John McGuire did not appear at all on his back porch, and Keith did not have the courage to make a bold advance to the McGuires' door and ask admittance. There came a day, however, when a cold east wind came up after they were well established in their porch chairs for the morning. They were on the Burtons' porch this time, and Keith suddenly determined to take the bull by the horns. "Brr, but it's cold this morning," he shivered blithely. "What say you? Let's go in. Come on." And without waiting for an acquiescence, he caught John McGuire's arm in his own and half pulled him to his feet. Before John McGuire knew then quite what was happening, he found himself in the house. No, that is, I think I'd better be going home," he stammered. But Keith Burton did not seem even to hear. "Say, just try your hand at this puzzle," he was saying gaily. "I gave it up, and I'll bet you'll have to," he finished, thrusting the pasteboard box into his visitor's hand. Adjusting the distance, a small table must be pushed in order to bring it conveniently in front of John McGuire's chair.
The quick tightening of John McGuire's lips and the proud lifting of his chin told that Keith's challenge had been accepted even before the laconic answer came. "Oh, you do you? Well, we'll see whether I'll have to give up or not." John McGuire loved picture puzzles, as Keith Burton well knew. It was easy after that. Keith took it so unhesitatingly for granted that they were to go indoors when it was cold that John McGuire found it difficult to object, and it was not long before the two boys were going back and forth between the two houses with almost as much ease as if their feet had been guided by the eye instead of by the tap of a slender stick. John McGuire was learning a great deal from Keith these days, though it is doubtful if he realized it. It is doubtful also if he realized how constantly he was being made to talk of the war and of his experience in it. But Keith realized it. Keith was not looking for the way now. He believed he had found it, and there came a day when he deemed the time had come to try to carry it out. They were in his own home living room. It had been a wonderful story that John McGuire had told that day, of a daring excursion into no man's land, and what came of it. Upstairs in the studio Daniel Burton was sitting alone, as Keith knew. Keith drew a long breath and made the plunge. Springing to his feet, he turned towards the door that led to the hall. "McGuire, that was a bully story, a corking good story. I want Dad to hear it. Wait, I'll get him." And he was out of the room with the door fast closed behind him before John McGuire could so much as draw a breath. Upstairs Daniel Burton, already in the secret, heard Keith's eager summons and came at once. For some days he had been expecting just such an urgent call from Keith's lips. He knew too much to delay. He was down the stairs and at Keith's side in an incredible short time. Then together they pushed open the door and entered the living room. John McGuire was on his feet. Very plainly he was intending to go home, and at once. But Daniel Burton paid no attention to that. He came straight toward him and took his hand. "I call this mighty good of you, McGuire," he said. "My boy here has been raving about your stories of the war until I'm fairly green with envy. Now I'm to hear a bit of them myself," he says. "I wish you would tell me some of your experiences, my lad. You know, a chance like this is a real godsend to us poor stay-at-homes. Now fire away. I'm ready." But John McGuire was not ready. True, he sat down, but not until after a confused, No, I must go home. That is, really, they're not worth repeating, those stories." And he would not talk at all at first. Daniel Burton talked, however. He talked of wars in general, and of the Civil War in particular. And he told stories of Antietam and Gettysburg as they had been told to him by his father. Then from Gettysburg he jumped to Flanders and talked of aeroplanes and gas masks and tanks and trenches and dugouts. Little by little then John McGuire began to talk, sometimes a whole sentence, sometimes only a word or two. But there was no fire, no enthusiasm, no impetuous rush of words that brought the very din of battle to their ears. And not once did Daniel Burton thrust his fingers into his pocket for his pencil and notebook. Yet when it was all over and John McGuire had gone home, Keith dropped into his chair with a happy sigh. "It wasn't much, Dad, I know," he admitted, "but it was something. It was a beginning, and a beginning is something with John McGuire." And it was something, for the next time Daniel Burton entered the room, John McGuire did not even start from his chair. He gave a faint smile of welcome, too, and he talked sooner and talked more, though there was little talk of war, and for the second time Daniel Burton did not reach for his pencil. But the third time he did. A question, a comment, a chance word, neither Keith nor his father could have told afterward what started it. They knew only that a sudden light as of a flame leapt into John McGuire's face, and he was back in the trenches of France and carrying them with him. At the second sentence Daniel Burton's fingers were in his pockets, and at the third his pencil was racing over the paper at breakneck speed. There was no pause then, no time for thought, no time for careful forming of words and letters. There was only the breakneck race between a bit of lead and an impassioned tongue, and when it was all over there were only a well-nigh hopeless-looking mass of hieroglyphics in Daniel Burton's notebook, and the sweat of spent excitement on the brows of 2 youths and a man. "Gee, we got it that time," breathed Keith after John McGuire had gone home. "Yes, only I was wondering if I had really got it," murmured Daniel Burton, eyeing a bit ruefully the confused mass of words and letters in his notebook. "Still, I reckon I can dig it out all right, if I do it right away," he finished confidently, and he did dig it out before he slept that night. If Daniel Burton and his son Keith thought the thing was done and it was going to be easy sailing thereafter, they found themselves greatly mistaken. John McGuire scarcely said 5 sentences about the war the next time they were together, though Daniel Burton had his pencil poised expectantly from the start. He said only a little more the next time and the next, and Daniel Burton pocketed his pencil in despair. Then came a day when a chance word about a new air raid, reported in the morning paper, acted like a match to gunpowder and sent John McGuire off into rapid-fire story that whipped Daniel Burton's pencil from his pocket and set it to racing again at breakneck speed to keep up with them. It was easier after that. Still, every day it was like a game of hide-and-seek, with Daniel Burton and his pencil ever in pursuit, and with now and then a casual comment or a tactful question to lure the hiding story out into the open. Little by little, as the frank comradeship of Daniel Burton won its way, John McGuire was led to talk more and more freely, and by Christmas the eager scribe was in possession of a very complete record of John McGuire's war experiences, dated even from the early days of his enlistment. Day by day, as he had taken down the rough notes, Daniel Burton had followed it up with a careful untangling and copying before he had a chance to forget, or to lose the wonderful glow born of the impassioned telling. Then, from time to time, he had sorted the notes and arranged them in proper sequence, until now he had a complete story, logical and well-rounded. It was on Christmas Day that he read the manuscript to Keith. At its conclusion, Keith drew a long, tremulous breath. "Dad, it's wonderful!" he exclaimed. "How did you do it?" You heard yourself." "Yes, but to copy it like that, why, I could hear him tell it as you read it, Dad. I could hear him." "Could you really? I'm glad. That makes me know I've succeeded. Now for a publisher." "You wouldn't publish without his knowing." "Certainly not. But I'm going to let a publisher see it before he knows." "Yes, perhaps." "Why, Keith, I'd have to do that. Do you suppose I'd run the risk of its being turned down and then have to tell the boy that he couldn't have the book after all?" No, I suppose not. But it isn't going to be turned down, Dad. Such a wonderful thing can't be turned down." Perhaps not." Daniel Burton's lips came together a bit grimly. "But there are wonderful things that won't sell, you know. However," he finished with a brisk cheerfulness, "this isn't one of my pictures, nor a bit of Susan's free verse, so there's some hope, I guess, anyhow. We'll see. But we won't tell John until we do see." "All right. I suppose that would be best," sighed Keith, still a little doubtfully. They had not long to wait, after all. In a remarkably short time came back a word from the publishers. Most emphatically they wanted the book, and they wanted it right away. Moreover, the royalty that was offered was so good that it sent Daniel Burton down the stairs 2 steps at a time like a boy, in his eagerness to reach Keith with the good news. "And now for John," he cried excitedly, as soon as Keith's joyous exclamations over the news were uttered. "Come, let's go across now." "But, Dad, how are you going to tell him?" Keith was holding back a little. "Tell him? I'm just going to tell him," laughed the man. "That's easy." "I know, but Keith wet his lips and started again. "You see, Dad, he didn't know we were taking notes of his stories. He couldn't see us. We took advantage of." But Daniel Burton would not even listen. "Shucks and nonsense, Keith!" he cried. Then a little grimly he added, "I only wish somebody'd take advantage like that of me, and sell a picture or 2 when I'm not looking. Come, we're keeping John waiting." And he took a firm hold of his son's arm. Yet in the McGuire living room, in the presence of John McGuire himself, he talked fully 5 minutes of nothing in particular before he said, "Well, John, I've got some good news for you." "Good news?" "That's what I'd call it. I hear you're going to have a book out in the spring." "I'm going to what?" "Have a book out. War stories. They were too good to keep to ourselves, John, so I jotted them down as you told them, and last week sent them off to a publisher." A real publisher?" The boy's voice shook. Every trace of color had drained from his face. "You bet your life, and one of the biggest in the country." Daniel Burton's own voice was shaking. He had turned his eyes away from John McGuire's face. "And they'll print it?" "Just as soon as ever you'll sign the contract. And by the way, that contract happens to be a mighty good one for a first book, my boy." John McGuire drew a long breath. The color was slowly coming back to his face. "But I can't seem to quite believe it," he faltered. "Nonsense! Simplest thing in the world," insisted Daniel Burton briskly. "They saw the stories, liked them, and are going to publish them. That's all." "All? All?" The blind boy was on his feet, his face working with emotion. "When all my life I've dreamed and dreamed and longed for—" He stopped short and sat down. He had the embarrassed air the habitually reserved person usually displays when caught red-handed making a scene. He gave a confused laugh. "I was only thinking what a way. You see, I'd always wanted to be a writer, but I'd given it up long ago. I had my living to earn, and I knew I couldn't earn it that way, not at first. I used to say I'd give anything if I could write a book, and I was just wondering if I'd been willing then to have given my eyes." End of chapter 28. Recording by Sunny. Chapter 29 of Dawn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sunny. Dawn by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 29. Dorothy Tries Her Hand. It was on a mild day in February that Susan met Dorothy Parkman on the street. She stopped her at once. "Well, if I ain't glad to see you!" she cried. "I didn't know you'd got back." "I haven't been back long, Susan." "You ain't been over to see us once, Miss Dorothy," Susan reproached her. I have been very busy." Miss Dorothy seemed ill at ease and anxious to get away. "And you didn't come for a long, long time when you was here last fall." Susan had laid a detaining hand on the girl's arm now. "Didn't I?" Miss Dorothy smiled brightly. "Well, perhaps I didn't, but you didn't need me anyway. I've heard all about it, the splendid work Mr. Burton and his son have done for John McGuire, and I'm so glad." "Oh, yes, that's all right." Susan spoke without enthusiasm. "And the book is going to be published?" "Yes. Oh, yes." Susan still spoke with a preoccupied frown. "Why, Susan, what's the matter? I thought you'd be glad." Susan drew a long sigh. "I am glad, Miss Dorothy. I'm awful glad for John McGuire. They say it's wonderful, the change in him already. He's so proud and happy to think he's done it. Not sinfully proud, you understand, but just humbly proud and glad. And his mama says he's writing other things now, poems and stories, and he's as happy as a lark all day. And I'm awful glad. But it's Keith hisself that I'm thinking of. You see, only yesterday I found him crying." "Crying?" Miss Dorothy seemed to have forgotten all about her haste to get away. She had Susan's arm in her grasp now. She had pulled her to one side, too, where they could have a little sheltered space to talk, in the angle of two store windows. "Yes, crying. You see, 'twas like this," hurried on Susan. "Mis' McGuire was over, and I'd been readin' a new poem to her and him. 'Twas a real pretty one, too, if I do say it as shouldn't. The best I ever done. All about how fame and beauty and pleasure didn't count nothin' besides workin'. I got the idea out of somethin' I found in a magazine. 'Twas just grand, and it gave me the perspiration right away to turn it into a poem. And I did, and 'twas that I was readin'. I'd just got it done that mornin'." "Yes, yes," nodded Miss Dorothy. "I see." "Well, I never thought of its meanin' anything to Keith, or of his takin' it nohow wrong. But after Mis' McGuire had gone home, she came out and set with me a spell, first in the kitchen. I heard a queer little noise in the sittin' room, and I went and looked in. Keith was at the table, his arms flung straight out in front of him, and his head bowed down, and Miss Dorothy, he was crying like a baby. "Oh, Susan, what did you do? What did you say?" "Say? Nothin'!" Susan's eyes flashed her scorn. "Do you suppose I'd let that poor lamb know I see him cryin'? Well, I guess not. I backed out as soft as a feather bed, and I didn't go near that sittin'-room for an hour, nor let any one else. I was a regular dragonfly guardin' it. Well, by and by Keith comes out. His face was white and strained lookin', but he was smilin', and he handed out my poem. I'd left it on the table when I come out with Mis' McGuire. 'I found this paper on the table, Susan. It's your poem, isn't it?' he says, real cheerful like. Then he turns kind of quick and leaves the room without another word. Well, I didn't know then 'twas the poem he'd been cryin' over. I didn't know till this mornin'. Then something he said made me see right off." "Why, Susan, what was it?" "'Twas something about work. But first, you wouldn't understand it unless you see the poem. And I can show it to you, 'cause I got it right here. I'm tryin' to memorialize it, so I keep it with me all the time and repeat one line over and over till I get it. It's right here in my bag. You'll find it's the best I've wrote, Miss Dorothy. I'm sure you will," she went on a bit wistfully. "You see, I used a lot of the words that was in the magazine. Not that I pleasurized it any, of course. Mine's different, 'cause mine is poetry and theirs is prosy. There, I guess maybe you can read it, even if it's my writin'," she finished, taking a sheet of notepaper from her bag and carefully spreading it out for Miss Dorothy to read. And this is what Dorothy read: Contentment. Wealth. I asked for the earth, but when in my hands it shriveled and crumbled away, and the green of its trees and the blue of its skies changed to a somber gray. Beauty. I asked for the moon, but the shimmering thing was only reflected gold, and vanished away at my glance and touch, and was then but a tale that is told. Pleasure. I asked for the stars, and lots of them came and twinkled and danced for me, but the whirling light soon wearied my gaze. I quenched their flame in the sea. Fame. I asked for the sun, but the fiery ball, brought down from its home on high, scorched and blistered my fingertips as I swirled it back to the sky. Labor. I asked for a hoe, and I set me to work, and my red blood danced as I went. At night I rested, and looking back, I counted my day well spent. "But, Susan, I don't see," began Miss Dorothy, lifting puzzled eyes from the last line of the poem. "I don't see what there is about that to make Mr. Keith cry." "No, I didn't till this mornin', and then, well, Keith came out into the kitchen and begun one of them tramps of his up and down the room. It always drives me nearly crazy when he does that, but I can't say anything, of course. I did begin this mornin' to talk about John McGuire, and how fine it was he'd got somethin' he could do, and thought it would take the poor boy's mind off hisself if I could get him talkin' about John McGuire. He's been so interested in John all winter, and so glad he could help him. You know he's always wanted to help somebody hisself instead of always havin' somebody helpin' him. But, dear me, instead of it bein' a quieter now for him, it was a regular stir-up. That's just it, Susan," he moans. "You've got to have your work or you die. There's nothin' in the whole world like work. Your work. John McGuire's got his work, and I'm glad of it. But where's mine? Where's mine, I tell you?" And I told him he'd just been havin' his work, helpin' John McGuire. You know it was wonderful, perfectly wonderful, Miss Dorothy, the way the two men got hold of John McGuire. You know John wouldn't speak to anybody, not anybody, till Keith and his father found some way to get on the inside of his shell. And Keith's been so happy all winter doin' it, and his father too. So I tried to remind him that he'd been doin' his work. But it didn't do no good. Keith said that was all very well, and he was glad, of course, but that was only a little bit of a thing, and 'twas all past and gone, and John didn't need him any more, and there wasn't anything left for him now at all. Oh, Miss Dorothy, he talked awfully. I never heard him run on so, and I knew from a lot of it that he had said that he was thinking of that poem. He wouldn't ask for wealth or beauty or fame or anything, and that there didn't anything count but labor. You see?" "Yes, I see." Miss Dorothy's voice was very low. Her face was turned quite away, yet Susan was very sure there were tears in her eyes. "And his father, he's 'most as bad as Keith," sighed Susan. "They're both as nervous as witches, what with the war and all, and their not being able to do anything. Oh, they do give money, lots of it. Liberty bonds and Red Cross and drives, of course. You knew they'd got it now, their money, didn't you, Miss Dorothy?" "Yes, I'd heard so." "Not that it seems to do 'em any particular good," complained Susan wistfully. "Oh, of course things ain't so ambiguous as they was, an' we have more to eat an' wear, an' don't have to worry about bills. But they ain't any happier's I can see. If only Keith could find somethin'." "Yes, I know," sighed Miss Dorothy again, as she turned slowly away. "I wish he could." "Well, come to see us, won't you?" urged Susan anxiously. "That'll help some. It'll help a lot." But Miss Dorothy did not seem to have heard. At least she did not answer. Yet not 24 hours later she was ringing the Burtons' doorbell. "No, no, not there. I want to see you," she panted a little breathlessly, when Susan would have led her away to the living room. "But Keith would be so glad," begged Susan. "No, no, I particularly don't want him to know I'm here," insisted Dorothy. And without further ado, but with rebellious lips and eyes, Susan led the way to the kitchen. "Susan, I have a scheme I think that may help out Mr. Keith," began the young girl abruptly. "I'll have to begin by telling you something of what I've seen during those last 2 or 3 months while I've been away. A Mr. Wilson, an old college friend of my father's, has been taking a lot of interest in the blind, especially since the war. He got to thinking of the blinded soldiers and wishing he could help them. He had seen some of them in Canada and talked with them. What he thought of first for them was brooms and basket weaving and chair caning, same as everybody does. But he found they had a perfect horror of those things. They said nobody bought such things except out of pity. They'd rather have the machine-made kind. And these men didn't want things bought of them out of pity. You see, they were big, well, strong young fellows like John McGuire here, and they were groping around trying to find a way to live all those long years of darkness that they knew were ahead of them. They didn't have any special talent, but they wanted to work, do something that was necessary, not be charity folks, as they called it. "I know," responded Susan sympathetically. "Well, this Mr. Wilson is at the head of a big electrical machinery manufacturing company near Chicago, like Mr. Sanborn's here, you know. And suddenly one day it came to him that he had the very thing right in his own shop, a necessary kind of work that the blind could be taught to do. My land, what was it? Think of blind folks going to work in a big shop like Tom Sanborn's." "I know, but there was something. It was wrapping the coils of wire with tape. Mr. Wilson said they used hundreds of thousands of these coils all the time, and they had to be wrapped to insulate them. It was this work that he believed the blind could learn to do. Anyhow, he was determined to try it, and try it he did. He sent for those soldiers he had talked with in Canada, and he took 2 or 3 of Father's patients and opened a little winding room with a good electrical engineer in charge. And do you know, it was wonderful the way those poor fellows took hold of that work. Why, they got really skillful in no time, and they learned to do it swiftly, too." "My land!" breathed Susan again. "They did. He took me in to see them one day. It was just a big room on the ground floor of an office building. He didn't put 'em in his shop. He said he wanted to keep them separate, for the present, anyway. It had 2 or 3 long tables, and the superintendent moved up and down the room overseeing their work and helping where it was necessary. There was a new man that morning, and it was perfectly wonderful how he took hold of it. And they were all so happy, laughing and talking and having the best time ever. But they sobered up real earnest when Mr. Wilson introduced 1 or 2 of them to me. One man in particular. He was one of the soldiers, a splendid, great, blond fellow, 6 feet tall and only 21. Told me what this work meant to them, how glad they were to feel of real use in the world. Then his face flushed and his shoulders straightened a bit. "And we're even helpin' a little to win the war," he said. "For these coils we're windin' now or for some armatures to go in some big motors that are going to be used in making munitions. So you see we are helping a little." Bless his heart, he didn't know how much he was helping everyone just by his big, brave courage. "Well, Susan, all this gave me an idea, after what you said yesterday about Mr. Keith, and I wondered why couldn't he wind coils too? And maybe he'd get others to do it also. So I went to Mr. Sanborn, and he's perfectly willing to let us give it a trial. He's pleased and interested, and says he will furnish everything for the experiment, including a first-class engineer to superintend it. Only he can't spend any time over it himself, and we'll have to get somebody else to take charge and make arrangements about the place and the starting of it, and all that. And, Susan, now comes my second idea. Could we, do you suppose, we could get Mr. Daniel Burton to take charge of it?" "Oh, Miss Dorothy, if only we could!" "It would be so fine for Mr. Keith and for all the others. I've been hearing everywhere how wonderfully he got hold of John McGuire." He did!" cried Susan. "And he's like a different man all the time he was doing it. He hadn't no use for his painting lately, and he's been so uneasy. I'm sure he'll do it, if you ask him." "Good. Then I will. Is he home to-day?" "Yes, he's upstairs. I'll call him." Susan sprang to her feet with alacrity. "But, Susan, just a minute." Miss Dorothy had put out a detaining hand. Is Mr. Keith here, too?" "Yes, both of 'em. Keith's in the sitting room, and I'll call his father down. 'Twon't take but just a minute." Susan was plainly chafing at the detaining hand. "No, no, Susan." Miss Dorothy, too, had sprung to her feet. If Mr. Keith is here, I'll wait. I want to see Mr. Daniel Burton first, alone, to tell him about it, you know," she added hastily, as Susan began to frown her disappointment. "But I don't see why," argued Susan, her disapproving eyes on the girl's flushed cheeks. "I should think you'd want to talk it up with both of 'em." Yes, of course, but not at first," stammered Miss Dorothy, plainly growing more and more embarrassed as she tried to appear less so. "I would rather that is, I think it would be better to ask Mr. Daniel Burton first, and then after we get it well started let him tell his son. So I'll come by to-morrow in the morning at 10. Mr. Keith is with Mr. John McGuire then, isn't he? And over at his house? I heard he was." "Yes, he is, most generally." "Then I'll come then. If you'll tell Mr. Daniel Burton, please," hurried on Miss Dorothy, "and ask him to see me, and please, please keep it from Mr. Keith, Susan. Truly, I don't want him to know a thing about it until his father and I have got it all fixed up," she finished. "But, Miss Dorothy, I know that Keith would want to—" "Susan!" With an imperiousness quite foreign to her usual manner, Miss Dorothy cut in sharply. "If you don't promise to speak only to Mr. Daniel Burton about this matter, I shall not come at all." "Oh, land sakes! Well, have it your own way," snapped Susan. "You promise?" "Yes, I promise." Susan's lips obeyed her, but her eyes were still mutinous. "Good. Thank you, Susan. Then I'll come to-morrow at 10, nodded Miss Dorothy once again, her smiling, gracious self, as she turned to leave the room. End of Chapter 29. Recording by Sunny. Chapter 30 of Dawn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sunny. Dawn by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 30. Daniel Burton's Job. Dorothy came at 10, or, to be strictly accurate, at 5 minutes past 10. The additional 5 minutes had been consumed by her going out of her way around the block so that she might see if Keith were visible in one of the McGuire's windows. He was visible, and when she went up the Burton walk at 5 minutes past 10, her step was confident and her face eager, and there was about her manner none of the furtive nervous questioning that had marked her coming the day before. "Good morning, Susan," she began cheerily, as Susan answered her ring. "Did Mr. Burton say he would see me?" "He did, and Mr. Keith is over at the McGuires' all safe, so you don't have to worry about him." Susan's eyes were still mutinous, her voice still coldly disapproving. "Yes, I know he is," nodded Miss Dorothy with a bright smile. "Oh, you do?" "Yes. Well, that is, I—" Under Susan's uncompromising frigidity, Miss Dorothy's stammering tongue came to a painful pause. Vouchsafed Susan. "Well, come in, and I'll tell Mr. Daniel Burton you're here." The emphasis on Daniel was not lost, was shown by the sudden broad smile that chased away the confusion on Miss Dorothy's face, as Susan led the way to the living room. 2 minutes later, Daniel Burton, thinner, paler, and more worn-looking than Dorothy had ever seen him before, entered the room and held out a cordial hand.
"Good morning, Miss Dorothy. I'm glad to see you," he said. "What is it? Red Cross? YMCA? Smilage books?" The whimsical smile on his lips only served to emphasize the somber pain in his eyes.
"Not any of them. Then Susan didn't tell you?"
"Not a word. Sit down, please."
"Thank you. Then I shall have to begin at the beginning," sighed the girl a little constrainedly, as she took the chair he offered her. I have a certain project that I want to carry out, Mr. Burton, and I want your help."
"Why, of course, certainly. I shall be glad to, I know."
Daniel Burton's hand had already reached for his checkbook.
"Any project of yours, Miss Dorothy? How much do you want?"
But Miss Dorothy lifted her hand, palm outward. "Thank you, Mr. Burton, but not any in money just yet. Oh, it'll take money, probably, to get it started, before it's on a self-supporting basis, I suppose. But it isn't money I want to-day, Mr. Burton. It's yourself." The man gave a short, dry laugh, not untinged with bitterness.
"I'm afraid I can't endorse either your taste or your judgment here, Miss Dorothy. You've come for a poor sick. I can't imagine myself as being much benefit to any sort of project. However, I shall be glad to hear about it, of course. What is it?"
And Miss Dorothy told him. With her eyes shining and her voice quivering with eagerness, she told the story as she had told Susan the afternoon before, but with even greater elaboration of detail. "And so now, Mr. Burton, you will help, won't you?" she begged, in closing.
"Help? My dear girl, how?"
"Take charge. Be the head and shoulders, the backbone of the whole thing. Oh, yes, I know it's a whole lot to ask," she hurried on, as she saw the dawning dismay and refusal on his face. "But I thought, for the sake of the cause—"
"The cause?" The man's voice was bitter as he interrupted her. "I'd crawl to France on my hands and knees if that would do any good. But, my dear young lady, I'm an ignoramus, and worse than an ignoramus when it comes to machinery. I'll venture to wager that I wouldn't know the tape from the coils, or whatever they are."
"Oh, we'd have an engineer for that part, of course," interposed the girl eagerly. "And we want your son, too."
"You want Keith? Pray, do you expect him to teach how to wind coils?"
No, not exactly, though I think he will be teaching before he realizes it. I want him to learn to wind them himself, and thus get others to learn. You don't understand, Mr. Burton. I want you and Keith to do just what you did for John McGuire, arouse interest and enthusiasm, and get them to do it. Don't you see?"
"But that was Keith, not I, in the case of John McGuire."
"It was you at the last," corrected the girl gently. "Mr. Burton, John McGuire wouldn't have any book out this spring if it weren't for you and your eyes."
Perhaps not. Still, there'd have been a way, probably. But even if I grant that, all you say in the case of John McGuire, that isn't winding armatures, or whatever they are."
"Mr. Burton, you aren't going to refuse?" pleaded the girl.
"What else can I do, Miss Dorothy? You don't want to stamp this project of yours a failure from the start, do you?"
Words, voice, manner, and gesture were unmistakable. All the longing and heartache and bitterness of the years of fruitless effort and final disappointment pulsated through that one word, failure. For a moment nobody spoke. Daniel Burton had got to his feet and crossed the room to the window. The girl, watching him with compassionate eyes as he stood looking out, had caught her breath with a little choking sigh. Suddenly she lifted her head resolutely. "Mr. Burton, you've got one gift that I don't believe you realize at all you possess. Like John McGuire, you make folks see what you are talking about. Perhaps it's because you can paint pictures with a brush, or perhaps it's because you've got such a wonderful command of words." Miss Dorothy stumbled a little precipitately into this sentence. She had not failed to see the disdainful movement of the man's head and shoulders at the mention of his pictures. "Whatever it is," she hurried on, "you've got it. I saw it first years ago, with your son. When I used to see him at father's, he would sit and talk to me by the hour about the woods and the fields and the mountains and sunsets and flowers back home, and little by little I found out that they were the pictures you drew for him on the canvas of his soul. You've done it again now for John McGuire. Do you suppose you could have caught those wonderful stories of his with your pencil if you hadn't been able to help him visualize them for himself? You and Keith together with your wonderful enthusiasm and interest? I know you couldn't, and that's why I want you now for you and your son, because he's blind and knows and understands as no seeing person can know and understand. They will trust him. They will follow where he leads. But behind him has got to be you. You've got to be the eyes for them all. Not to teach the work. We'll have others for that. Any good mechanic will do for that part. But it's the other part of it, the soul of the thing. These men, lots of them, are but little more than boys. Big, strong, strapping fellows with the whole of life before them. And they are blind. Whichever way they turn, a big black curtain shuts them in. And it's those 4 black curtains that I want you to paint. I want you to give them something to look at, something to think of, something to live for, and you can do it. And when you've done it, you'll find they're the best and the biggest pictures you ever painted." Her voice broke with the last word and choked into silence. Over at the window the man stood motionless. 1 minute, 2 minutes passed. Then a bit abruptly he turned, crossed the room to the girl's side, and held out his hand. "Miss Dorothy, I'll take the job," he said. He spoke lightly, and he smiled as he said the words, but neither the smile nor the lightness of his manner quite hid the shake in his voice nor the moisture in his eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Burton. I was sure you would," cried the girl. "And now for Keith. He's over at the McGuires'. I'll get him," explained the man boyishly. But Miss Dorothy was instantly on her feet. "No, no, please," she begged a little breathlessly. "I'd rather you didn't now. I think we'd better get a little farther along before we tell him. There's a whole lot to do, you know, getting the room and the materials and the superintendent and all that. And there isn't a thing he can do yet." "All right, very good. Perhaps that would be better," nodded the man. "But let me tell you, I already have some workers for your project." "You mean Jack Green? Here in town?" "No. Oh, we'd want him, of course. But it's some others, a couple of boys from Hillsboro. I had a letter yesterday from the father of one of the boys, asking what to do with his son. He thought because of Keith that I could help him. It was a pitiful letter. The man was heartbroken and utterly at sea. His boy, only 19, had come home blind and well nigh crazed with the tragedy of it, and the father didn't know which way to turn. That's why he appealed to me, you see, on account of Keith." "Yes, I understand," said the girl gently, as the man left his sentence unfinished. "I've had others, too, several of them in the last few weeks. If you'll wait, I'll get the letters." He was already halfway to the door. "It may take a minute or two to look them up, but they'll be worth it, I think." "Of course they will," she cried eagerly. "They'll be just exactly what we want, and I'm not in a bit of a hurry," she finished, dropping back in her chair as the door closed behind him. Alone, she looked over the room, her eyes wistful, brimming with unshed tears. Over by the window was Keith's chair, before it the table with a half-completed picture puzzle spread upon it. Near the table was a set of shelves containing other picture puzzles, games, and books, all, as the girl well knew, especially designed and constructed for eyes that could not see. She had risen to her feet and half started to cross the room towards the table when the door to the side hall opened and Keith Burton entered the room. With a half-stifled gasp the girl stepped back to her chair. The blind boy stopped instantly, his face turned toward her.
"Is that you, Susan?"
The girl wet her lips, but no words came.
"Who's there, please?"
He spoke sharply this time, as everybody knew who knew Keith. The one thing that angered him more than anything else was the attempted deception as to one's presence in the room. Miss Dorothy gave a confused little laugh and put her hand to her throat. "Why, Keith, it's only I. Don't look so—"
"You!"
For one brief moment his face lighted up as with a hidden flame. Then instantly it changed. It became like the gray of ashes after the flame is spent.
"Why didn't you speak then?" he questioned. "It did no good to keep quiet. You mustn't forget that I have ears. I haven't eyes."
"Nonsense, Keith!" She laughed again, confusedly, though her own face had paled a little. "I did speak as soon as I caught my breath. Popping in on a body like that!"
"But I didn't know you were here," stammered the young fellow uncertainly. "Nobody called me. I beg your pardon if—" He came to a helpless pause.
"Not a bit of it. You needn't. It wasn't necessary at all." The girl tossed off the words with a lightness so forced that it was almost flippancy. "You see, I didn't come to see you at all. It was your father."
"My father?"
"Certainly."
But does he know?"
The girl laughed merrily, too merrily for sincerity. "No, indeed he does. We've just been having a lovely talk. He's gone upstairs for some letters. He's coming right back. Right back."
Oh.
Was it an indefinable something in her voice, or was it the repetition of the last two words? Whatever it was that caused it, Keith turned away with a jerk, walked with the swift sureness of long familiarity straight to the set of shelves, and took down a book.
"Then I'll not disturb you any further, as long as you're not needing me," he said tersely. "I only came for this."
And with barely a touch of his cane to the floor and door casing, he strode from the room. The pity of it, that he could not have seen Dorothy Parkman's eyes looking after him. End of chapter 30. Recording by Sunny. Chapter 31 of Dawn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sunny. Dawn by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 31. What Susan Did Not See. There was apparently no limit to Daniel Burton's enthusiastic cooperation with Dorothy Parkman on the matter of establishing a workroom for the blind. He set to work with her at once. The very next morning after her initial visit he went with her to Mazie Sanborn's father, and together they formulated the first necessary plans. Thomas Sanborn was generous and cordially enthusiastic, though his words and manner carried the crisp terseness of a busy man whose time is money. At the end of 5 minutes he summoned one David Patch to the office and introduced him to Miss Dorothy and Daniel Burton as one of his most expert engineers.
"And now I'll turn the whole thing over to you," he declared briskly,
with his finger already on the button that would summon his stenographer for dictation.
"Just step into that room there and stay as long as you like. Whatever Patch says I'll back up. You'll find him thoroughly capable and trustworthy. And now good luck to you," he finished, throwing wide the door of the adjoining room. The next moment Miss Dorothy and Daniel Burton found themselves alone with the keen-eyed, alert little man who had been introduced as David Patch. And David Patch did, indeed, appear to be very capable. He evidently understood his business, and he gave interested attention to Miss Dorothy's story of what she had seen and of what she wished now to try to do. He took them then for a tour of the great shop, especially to the department where the busy fingers were winding with tape the thousands of wire coils. Miss Dorothy's eyes sparkled with excitement, and she fairly clapped her hands in delight, while Daniel Burton said that even he could see the possibilities of that kind of work for their purpose. At the end of a long hour of talking and planning, Miss Dorothy and Daniel Burton started for home. But even then Daniel Burton had yet more to say, for at his gate, which was on Miss Dorothy's way home, he begged her to come in for a moment. "I had another letter to-day about the blind soldier, this time from Baltimore. I want to show it to you. You see, so many write to me on account of my own boy. You will come in just a minute?"
"Why, yes, of course I will." The pause and the half-stifled word that finished the sentence came as the tall figure of Keith Burton turned the corner of the piazza and walked toward the steps.
"Hello, Dad?"
Keith's voice was questioning.
"Yes, and
Dorothy Parkman," broke in the girl, with a haste so precipitate as to make her almost choke.
Miss Parkman?"
Once again, for a moment, Keith's face lighted as with flame. Come around to the south side," he cried eagerly. "I've been sunning myself there. You'd think it was May instead of March."
"No, she can't go and sun herself with you," interposed Daniel Burton with mock severity. "She's coming with me into the house. I want to show her something."
"Well, I like that," retorted the youth. He spoke jauntily and gave a short little laugh, but the light had died from his face and a slow red had crept to his forehead.
"Well, she can't. She's coming with me," reiterated the man. "Now run back to your sun bath. If you're good, maybe we'll be out pretty soon." He laughed back at his son as he opened the house door for his guest. "That's right. You didn't want him to know yet, did you?" he added, looking a bit anxiously into the girl's somewhat flushed face as he closed the hall door.
"Quite right. No, I don't want him to know yet. There's so much to be done to get started, and he'd want to help. And he couldn't help about that part, and 'twould only fret him and make him unhappy."
"My idea exactly," nodded the man. "When we get the room and the goods there, we'll want to tell him then."
"Of course you'll tell him then," cried the girl.
"Yes, indeed, of course we will,"
exclaimed the man, very evidently not noticing the change in the pronoun.
"Now, if you'll wait a minute, I'll get that letter. Then we'll go out to Keith on the piazza."
It was a short letter, and one quickly read, and very soon they were out on the piazza again. But Miss Dorothy said "No, no," very hastily, when he urged her to go round the other side, and she added, "I really must go home now," as she hurried down the steps. Daniel Burton went then around the corner of the piazza to explain her absence to his son Keith. But he need not have hurried. His son Keith was not there. For all the good progress that was made on that first day, things seemed to move a bit slowly after that. To begin with, the matter of selecting suitable room gave no little difficulty. The right room in the right location seemed not to be had, and Daniel Burton even suggested that they use some room in his own house, but after a little thought he gave up the idea as being neither practical nor desirable. Meanwhile, he was in daily communication with Dorothy Parkman, and they spent 2 hours together thrashing out the different problems one by one as they arose, sometimes at her home, more frequently at his. For home to Dorothy in Hinsdale meant the Sanborn house, where Mazie was always in evidence, and Daniel Burton did not care for Mazie. Especially he did not care for her advice and assistance on the problems that were puzzling him now. To be sure, at his own home there was Keith, but he contrived to avoid Keith on most occasions. Besides, Keith himself seemed quite inclined to keep out of the way, particularly if he heard the voice of Dorothy Parkman, which did not disturb Daniel Burton in the least, under the circumstances. Till they got ready to tell Keith, he was rather glad that he did keep so conveniently out of the way, and as Dorothy seemed always glad to avoid seeing Keith or talking to him, there was really very little trouble on that score, and they could have their consultations in peace and quietness. And there were so many of them, those consultations. When at last the room was found, there were the furnishings to select and the final plans to be made for the real work to be done. David Patch proved himself to be invaluable then. As if by magic a long table appeared, and the coils and the tape and all the various paraphernalia of the property-equipped winding-room marched smoothly into place. Meanwhile 3 soldiers and 1 civilian stood ready and eager to be taught, needing only the word of command to begin.
"And now we'll tell Keith," said Daniel Burton.
"Yes, now you must tell Keith," said Miss Dorothy.
"Tomorrow at 9.
"Tomorrow at 9," bowed Miss Dorothy.
"I'll bring him down and we'll show him."
"And I do so hope he'll like it."
"Of course he'll like it," cried Daniel Burton. "You wait and see."
But she did not see. She was not there to see. Promptly at 9 o'clock Daniel Burton appeared in the winding room with Keith, but Dorothy Parkman was nowhere in sight. He waited 10-15 minutes. Then he told Keith the story of the room, and what they'd hoped to do there, fuming meanwhile within himself because he had to tell it alone. But it was not lack of interest that kept Miss Dorothy away. It could not have been, for that very afternoon she sought Daniel Burton out and asked eagerly what his son had said, and how he had taken it. And her eyes shone, and her breath quickened at the story Daniel Burton told, and so eager was she to know every little word that had fallen from Keith's lips that she kept Daniel Burton repeating over and over each minute detail. Yet the next day, when Keith and 4 other blind youths began work in earnest, she never once went near Keith's chair, though she went often to the others, dropping here and there a word of encouragement or a touch of aiding fingers. When night came, however, and she found an opportunity for a few words alone with Daniel Burton, she told him that, in her opinion, Keith had done the best work of the 5, and that it was perfectly marvelous the way he was taking hold. And again her eyes sparkled and her breath quickened, and she spent the entire 10 minutes talking about Keith to his father. Yet the next day, when the work began again, she still went to the back of every chair but Keith's. Things happened very rapidly after that. It was not a week before the first long table in the big room was filled with eager workers, and the second one had to be added to take care of the newcomers. The project was already the talk of the town, and not the least excited and interested of the observers was John McGuire's mother. When the news came of the second table being added to the equipment of the place, she hurried over to Susan's kitchen without delay, though with the latest poem of her son as the ostensible excuse. "It's the stumbling block," she announced. "He just got it done yesterday, and I copied it for you. I think it's the best yet," she beamed, handing over a folded paper. "It's kind of long, so don't stop to read it now. Say, is it true? Have they had to put another table at that blind windin' room?" "They have." "Well, if that ain't the greatest! I think it's just grand. They took my son John down there to see the place yesterday, do you know? That boy is such a different being since his book and his writin', and he's learnin' to do such a lot of things for himself, and he's so happy in it. And he doesn't mind seein' anybody now. And it's all owin' to your wonderful Keith and his father. I wouldn't ever have believed it of them." Susan's chin came up a bit. "I would. I knew. And I always told you that Daniel Burton was a superlative man in every way, and his son just like him, only you wouldn't believe me." "Nobody'd believe you," maintained Mrs. McGuire spiritedly. "Nobody'd believe such a thing could be as my John being changed like that, and all those others down in the winding room, too. They say it's perfectly marvelous that Keith and his father are doing with those men and boys. Aren't they awfully happy over it? Keith and his father, I mean." "Daniel Burton is. Why, he's like a different man, Miss McGuire. You'd know that just to see him walk and hear him speak. And I don't hear nothin' more about his longin' to get over there. I guess he thinks he's got work enough to do right here, and he hardly ever touches his war maps these days." "But ain't Keith happy, too?" "Yes and no," hesitated Susan, her face clouding a little. "Oh, he's gone into it heart and soul, and while he's workin' on somethin' he's all right. But when it's all quiet and he's sittin' alone, I don't like the look on his face. But I know he's glad to be helpin' down there, and I know it's helpin' him, too." "It's helping everybody, not forgettin' Miss Dorothy Parkman," added Mrs. McGuire with a smile and a shrug, as she rose to go. "But then, of course, we all know what she's after." "After? What do you mean?" "Susan Betts." With a jerk Mrs. McGuire faced about. "It ain't possible, with eyes in your head, that you ain't seen." "Seen what?" "Well, my land, with that girl throwing herself at Daniel Burton's head for the last 6 weeks, and you calmly sit there and ask, 'Seen what?' Daniel Burton? Dorothy Parkman?" There's no mistaking Susan's dumbfounded amazement. "Yes, Daniel Burton and Dorothy Parkman. Oh, I used to think it was Keith, but when the money came to old Daniel, I guess she thought he wasn't so old after all. Besides, Keith with his handicap, you couldn't blame the girl after all, I suppose." "Daniel Burton and Dorothy Parkman?" repeated Susan, this time with the faintness of stupefaction. "Why, Susan, you must have seen it, her running in here every day, walking home with him, and talking to him every chance she gets." "But they've been making plans for the work," murmured Susan. "Work? Well, I guess it no need to have taken quite so many consultations just for the work. Besides, she never thought of such a scheme as this before the money came, did she?" "Not much she did." "Oh, come, Susan, wake up. She'll be walking off with him right under your nose if you don't look out," finished Mrs. McGuire with a sly laugh as she took her departure. Left alone, Susan sat for some time absorbed in thought, a deep frown on her face. Then, with a sigh and a shrug, as if throwing off an incomprehensible burden, she opened the paper Mrs. McGuire had left with her. Once, twice, 3 times she read the verses. Then, with a low chuckle, she folded up the paper, tucked it into her apron pocket, and rose to her feet. A minute later she had attacked the pile of dishes in the sink and was singing lustily. "I've taken my worries, I've taken my woes, I have, and shutting up where nobody knows, I have. I chucked 'em down, that's what I did, and now I'm sitting upon the lid, and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. I'm sitting upon the lid, I am, hurrah, hurrah. I'm trying to be a little lamb, hurrah, hurrah, but I'm feeling more like a great big slam than a nice little peaceful woolly lamb, but we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home." End of chapter 31. Recording by Sunny. Chapter 32 of Dawn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sunny. Dawn by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 32. The Key. There was no work in the winding room Saturday afternoons, and it was on Saturday afternoon that Susan found Keith sitting idle-handed in his chair by the window in the living room. As was her custom, she spoke the moment she entered the room, but not before she had noted the listless attitude and wistful face of the youth over by the window. "Keith, I've been thinking." "Bad practice, Susan, sometimes," he laughed whimsically. "Not this time." "Poetry?" She shook her head. "No, I ain't poetsin' so much these days, though I did write one yesterday about the ways of the world. I'm going to read it to you, too, by and by. But that's just a common poem about common, everyday folks, and this thing I was thinking about was different." "And so you couldn't put this into a poem, huh?" Susan shook her head again and sighed. "No, and it's been that way lots of times lately, especially since I seen John McGuire's poems so fine and beautimous. Oh, I have the perspiration to write lots of times, and I yield up to it and write. But somehow when it's done, I ain't said a mite of what I wanted to, and I ain't said it the way I want to, either. I think maybe having so many of 'em declined by them editors had made me kinder fearsome." "I'm afraid it has, Susan," he smiled. "Now, this afternoon, what I was thinking about, once I'd have made a poem of that easy, but today I didn't even try. I knew I couldn't do it. And say, Keith, it was you I was thinking about." "Heavens, Susan, a poem out of me? No wonder your muse balked. I'm afraid you'd find even perspiration wouldn't make a poem out of me." "Keith, do you remember?" Susan was still earnest and preoccupied. "I told you once, and it didn't make no difference if God had closed the door of your eyes. He'd open up another room to you sometime and give you the key to unlock the door. And He has. And now you've got it, that key." "I've got it? The key?" "Yes. That's work down there, helping them blind men and boys get hold of their souls again. Oh, Keith, don't you see? It's such a big, wide room that God has given you, and it's all yours. There ain't no one that can help them poor blind soldiers like you can, and you couldn't have done it if that door of your eyes hadn't been shut first. And that was what give you the key to this big, beautiful room of helping our boys that's come back to us blinded and half crazed with despair and discouragement. Oh, if only I could make you see it the way I do. But if I can't say it the right way, there's such a big, beautiful idea there. If only I could make you see it. That's why I wanted to write the poem."
"I can see it, Susan, without the poem." Keith was not smiling now. His face was turned away and his voice had grown a bit unsteady. "And I'm glad you showed it to me. It's going to help me a whole lot if I just keep remembering that key, I think." Susan threw a quick look into Keith's averted face. Then promptly she reached for the folded paper in her apron pocket. There were times when Susan was wise beyond her station as to when the subject should be changed.
"And now I'm going to read you the poem I did write," she announced briskly. "About everyday folks, different kind of folks. 6 of 'em. It shows that there ain't anyone anywhere that's really satisfied with their lot when you come right down to it, whether they've got eyes or not." And she began to read. "The way of the world. A beggar girl on the curbstone sat, all ragged and hungry-eyed. Across the street came Peggy McGee. The beggar girl saw and sighed. I wished I was rich as she, for she has got things to eat, and clothes and shoes and a place to live, and she don't beg in the street. When Peggy McGee the corner turned, she climbed to her garret high. From there she gazed through curtainless panes, a hanging of lace near by. Ah, me," sighed Peggy, "if I had those, and rugs like hers on the floor, it seems to me that I'd never ask for nothin' at all no more." From those curtains that self-same day looked a face all sour and thin. "I hate to live in this horrid street, in the children's yellin' din. And where's the good of my nice new things when nobody'll see or know? I really think that I ought to be a-livin' in Rich Man's Row." A carriage came from Rich Man's Row and rumbled by to the park. A lady sat on the carriage seat. "Oh, dear," she said, "what an ark! If only this coach could show some style, my clothes so shabby would pass. Now there's an auto quite my kind, but 'tisn't my own, alas." The auto carried a millionaire whose brow was knotted and stern. "A million is nowhere now," thought he. "That's something we all must learn. 'Tis millions many one has to be in the swim at all. This trying to live when one is so poor is really all folderol." A man of millions was just behind. The beggar was passin' by. Business at beggin' was good that day, and the girl was eatin' pie. The rich man looked, and he groaned aloud, and swore with his gouty pain, "I'd give my millions and more beside, could I eat like that again." "Now ain't that just like folks?" demanded Susan as she finished the last verse. Keith laughed. "I suspect it is, Susan, and by the way, I shouldn't wonder if this were quite the right time to show that I'm no different than other folks. You see, I, too, am going to make a change in living." "A change in living? What do you mean?" "Oh, not now, not quite yet. But you see, I've been doing some thinking, too. I've been thinking that if that is, when Father and Miss Parkman are married, that—" But Susan interrupted with a groan. "My sakes, Keith, have you seen it, too?" Keith laughed embarrassedly. "To be sure I have. You don't have to have eyes to see that, do you, Susan?" "Oh, good land, I don't know," frowned Susan irritably. "I don't s'pose—" She did not finish her sentence, and after a moment's silence Keith began again to speak. "I've been talking a little to David Patch, the superintendent, you know. We're going to take the whole house where we are for our work, pretty quick, and when we do, Patch and his wife will come there to live upstairs, and they'll take me to board. I asked them. Then I'll be right there handy all the time, you see, which will be a fine arrangement all around." "A fine arrangement, indeed, with you way off down there and living with David Patch." "But, Susan," argued Keith, a bit wearily, "I couldn't be living here, you know." "I should like to know why not." "Because I couldn't." He had grown very white now. "Besides, I think they would be happier without me here, and I know I should be." His voice was low and almost indistinct, but Susan heard and understood. "The very fact that once I thought that I was foolish enough to think—but, of course, as soon as I remembered my blindness,
and to tie a beautiful young girl down to—" He stopped short and pulled himself up. "Susan, are you still there?"
"I'm right here, Keith." Susan spoke constrainedly. He gave an embarrassed laugh. A painful red had suffused his face.
"I'm afraid I got to talking and forgetting I wasn't alone," he stumbled on hurriedly. I mean to go on to say that I hope they'd be very happy. Dad deserves it. And if they'd only hurry up and get it over with, it would be easier for me. Not that it matters, of course. Dad has had an awful lot to put up with me already, as it is, you know. The trouble, the care, the disappointment. You see, I was going to make up to him for all he had lost. I was going to be Jerry and Ned and myself all in a bunch. And now it turned out to be nothing. And worse than nothing.
Keith Burton, you stop.
It was the old imperious Susan back again.
You stop right where you be, and don't you never let me hear you say another word about you being a disappointment. Jerry and Ned, indeed. I wonder if you think a dozen Jerry and Neds could do what you've done. And no matter what they've done, they couldn't have done a bigger, splendider thing than you've done in triumphing over your blindness the way you've done, nor one that would make your father prouder of you. And let me tell you another thing, Keith Burton. No matter what you've done, no matter how many big pictures you painted or big books you wrote or how much money you made for your dad, there ain't anything you could have done that would do him so much solid good as what you have done.
Why, Susan, are you wild? I haven't done a thing. Not a thing for Dad.
Yes, you have. You've done the biggest thing of all by needing him.
Needing him?
Yes, Keith Burton. Look at your father now. Look at the splendid work he's doing. You know as well as I do that he used to be a thoroughly insufficient, uncapacious man. I thought I wouldn't let anybody else say it. Puttering over a mess of pictures that wouldn't sell for a nickel, and that he used to run from anything and everything that was unproprietous and disagreeable, like he was being chased. Well, then, you was took blind. And what happened? You know what happened. He came right up and toed the mark like a man and a gentleman, and he's toed it ever since. And I can tell you that the pictures he's painting now with his tongue for them poor blind boys to see is bigger and better than any pictures he could have painted with his pygmy paints if he worked on them for 1,000 years. And it's you that's done it for him, just by needing him. So there." And before Keith could so much as open his lips, Susan was gone, slamming the door behind her.
End of chapter 32. Recording by Sunny. Chapter 33 of Dawn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sunny. Dawn by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 33. And all on account of Susan. Not one wink did Susan Betts sleep that night. To Susan her world was tumbling about her ears in one dizzy whirl of destruction. Daniel Burton and Dorothy Parkman married and living there, and her beloved blind boy banished to a home with one David Patch? Unthinkable! And yet, well, if it had got to be, it had got to be, she supposed, the marriage. But they might at least be decent about it. As for keeping that poor blind boy harrowed up all the time and prolonging the agony, well, at least she could do something about that, thank goodness, and she would, too. When there was anything that Susan could do, particularly in the line of righting a wrong, she lost no time in doing it. Within 2 days, therefore, she made her opportunity and grasped it. A little peremptorily, she informed Miss Dorothy Parkman that she would like to speak to her, please, in the kitchen. Then, tall and cold and very stern, she faced her.
"Of course I understand, Miss Dorothy. I'm bustin' here where I ain't no business to, and ain't no excuse to offer except my boy Keith. It's for him I'm asking you to do it."
"To do what, Susan?" She had changed color slightly as she asked the question.
"Not to let it be so plain. The love-making."
"Scene? Love-making?" gasped the girl.
"Well, the talking to him and the whispering and consultin's and running here every day and
"I beg your pardon, Susan," interrupted the girl incisively. She had grown very white. "I'm tempted to make no sort of reply to such an absurd accusation. But I'm going to say, however, that you must be laboring under some mistake. I do not come here to see Mr. Keith Burton, and I've scarcely exchanged a dozen words with him for months."
"I'm talking about Mr. Daniel, not Keith, and—"
"Mr. Daniel Burton?"
"Of course. Who else?"
Susan was nettled now, and showed it.
"I don't suppose you deny running here to see him and talking to him and—"
No, wait. Don't say any more, please." The girl was half laughing, half crying. Her face was going from white to red and back to white again. "Am I to understand that I'm actually being accused of running after Mr. Daniel Burton? Of love-making towards him?" she choked incoherently.
"Why, yes, that is,
Oh, this is too much. First Keith, and now—" She broke off hysterically. "To think that— Oh, Susan, how could you? And by this time she dropped into her chair and covered her face with her hands. But she was laughing. Very plainly she was laughing. Susan frowned, stared, and frowned again.
"Then you ain't in love with—"
Suddenly her face cleared and broke into a broad smile.
"Well, my land, if that ain't the best joke ever! Of course you ain't in love with him. I don't believe I ever more'n half believed it anyway. Now it'll be dead easy, and all right, too."
But what does that all mean?" stammered the girl.
"Why, it's just that everybody thought you was after him, and 'twould be a match, you being together so much. But even then I wouldn't have said a thing if it hadn't been for Keith." "Keith?"
"Yes, poor boy. And it was hard for him, seeing you two together like this and thinking you cared for each other. And he's got his plans all made how, when you was married, he'd go and live with David Patch."
"David Patch? But why?" "Why, don't you see? 'Twouldn't be very easy to see you married to another man, would it? And loving you all the time hisself, and—"
"Loving me?"
"That's what I said."
Susan's lips came sharply together, and her keen eyes swept the girl's face. "But I think you must be mistaken again," faltered the girl, growing rosy.
"I ain't. I've always suspicioned it, and now I know it."
"But he's acted as if he didn't care for me at all, as if he hated me."
"That's because he cared so much."
"Nonsense, Susan."
"'Tain't nonsense. It's sense. As I told you, I've always suspicioned it, and last Saturday when I heard him talk, I knew. He was good as owned it up anyhow."
"But why didn't he tell me?" stammered the girl, growing still more rosy.
"Because he was blind."
"As if I minded!" She stopped abruptly and turned away her face. Susan drew a resolute breath and squared her shoulders.
"Then why don't you do something?" she demanded.
"Do something?"
"Yes, to show him that you don't mind."
"Oh, Susan, I couldn't do that."
"All right. Settle back then and do nothing. And he'll settle back and do nothing. And there'll be a pretty pair of you, eating your hearts out with love for each other, passing each other by with converted faces and highbrow chins, and all because you're afraid of offending Miss Grundy, who don't care no more about it than two sticks. But I suppose you'd both rather be miserable than brace up and defy the proprieties and live long and be happy ever after."
"But if I could be sure he cared," spoke the girl in a faint little voice.
"You would have been if you'd seen him Saturday as I did."
"And if—"
If, interrupted Susan impatiently. "And there that poor blind boy sits and thinks and thinks and thinks, and longs for someone that loves him to smooth his pillow and rumple his hair and—" "Susan, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it," vowed the girl, springing to her feet, her eyes like stars, her cheeks like twin roses.
"Do what?" demanded Susan.
"I don't know, but I'm going to do something.
Anyhow, whatever I do,
I know I'm going to divide the properties," she babbled deliriously as she hurried from the room, looking very much as if she were trying to hide from herself. 4 days later, Keith, in his favorite chair, sat on the south piazza. It was an April day, but it was like June, and the window behind him was wide open into the living room. He did not hear Dorothy Parkman's light step up the walk. He did not know that she had paused at sight of him, sitting there, and had put her hand to her throat, and then that she had almost run, light-footed, into the house, again very much as if she were trying to run away from herself. But he did hear her voice 2 minutes later, speaking just inside the window. At the first sentence he tried to rise. Then, with a despairing gesture, as if realizing that flight would be worse than to remain where he was, he sat back in his chair. And this is what he heard Dorothy Parkman say. "No, no, Mr. Burton, please. I can't marry you. You'll have to understand. No, don't speak. Don't say anything, please. There's nothing you can say that would make a bit of difference. It's just that I don't love you, and I do love somebody else. Keith, your son. Yes, you've guessed it. Oh, yes, I know we don't seem to be much to each other now, but whether we ever are or not, there can't ever be anyone else. And I think he cares. It's just that his pride won't let him speak, as if his dear eyes didn't make me love him. But I mustn't say all this to you. It's just that I wanted you to surely understand. And I must go. Now, I must go." And she went. She went hurriedly, a little noisily. She shut one door and another. Then, out on the piazza, she came face to face with Keith Burton.
"Dorothy! Oh, Dorothy, I heard!"
And then it was well, indeed, that the Japanese screen on the front piazza was down, for Keith stood with his arms outstretched, and Dorothy, with an ineffable, contented little indrawn breath, walked straight into them. And with that light on his face, she would have walked into them had he been standing in the middle of the sidewalk outside. To Dorothy, at that moment, nobody in all the world counted for a feather's weight, except the man who was holding her close, with his lips to hers. Later, a little later, when they sat side by side on the piazza settee, and when coherence and logic had become attributes to their conversation, Keith sighed with a little catch in his voice.
"The only thing I regret about all this, the only thing that makes me feel cheap and mean is that I've won where Dad lost out. Poor old Dad."
There was the briefest of pauses. Then a small, subdued voice said, I suspect, Keith, confession is good for the soul."
"Well?"
he demanded in evident mystification. "Anyhow, I'll have to do it. Your father wasn't there at all."
"But I heard you speaking to him, my dear."
She shook her head and stole a look into his face, then caught her breath with a little choking sob of heartache because he could not see the love she knew was in her eyes. But the heartache only nerved her to say the words that almost refused to come. He wasn't there," she repeated, fencing for time.
"But who was there? I heard you call him by name, Mr. Burton, clearly, distinctly. I know I did."
But he wasn't there. Nobody was there. I was just talking to myself."
"You mean practicing what you were going to say?" questioned Keith doubtfully. "And that he doesn't know yet that you are going to refuse him?"
No. Well, yes, that is, I mean, it's true. He doesn't know I'm going to refuse him." There was a hint of smoldering laughter in the girl's voice.
"Dorothy!"
The arm about her waist perceptibly loosened and almost fell away.
"Why, I don't feel now that you have belonged to me yet, and I think of poor Dad."
The girl caught her breath and stole another look into his face. "But, Keith, you don't understand. He hasn't proposed to me yet. That is, I mean," she amended hastily, he isn't going to propose to me ever."
"But he was. He cares. And now he'll have to know about us."
"But he wasn't. He doesn't. You don't understand, Keith. He never thought of proposing to me. I know he didn't."
Then what, Dorothy, what do you mean by all this?
Why, it's just that is, oh, Keith, why will you make me tell you?" she cried between hysterical little laughs and sobs. "And yet I'd have to tell you, of course. I knew you were there on the porch, and I knew you'd hear what I said, and so to make you understand. Oh, Keith, it was awful, but I pretended that—"
"You darling!" breathed an impassioned voice into her ear. "Oh, how I love you for that!"
"Oh, but Keith, it really was awful of me," she cried, blushing and laughing as she emerged from his embrace. "Susan told me to divide the properties, and I did."
"Susan?"
She nodded. "That's how I knew for sure that you cared."
"And so I owe it all, even my proposal of marriage to Susan?" he bantered mischievously.
"Keith, I did not it was not a proposal of marriage."
"No, but you're going to marry me, aren't you?" Her chin came up.
I shall wait till I'm asked," she retorted with dignity.
Well, I reckon it's safe to say you'll be asked. And so I owe it all to Susan. Well, it isn't the first good thing I've owed to her, bless her heart, and she's equal to most anything. But I'll wager in this case that even Susan had some stunt to perform. How did she do it?"
"She told me that you thought your father and I cared for each other, and that you cared for me, but that you were very brave and you were going to go away and leave us to our happiness. Then, when she found there was nothing to the other part of it, and that I cared for you, well, I don't know how she did it, but she said, well, I did it, that's all."
Keith chuckled. "Exactly. You couldn't have described it better. We've always done what Susan wanted us to, and we never could tell why. We just did it, that's all. And oh, I'm so glad you did this, little girl, so glad."
"Yes, but—" She drew away from him a little, and her voice became severely accusing. "Keith Burton, you should have done it yourself, and you know it." He shook his head.
"I couldn't." A swift shadow fell like a cloud over his countenance. "Darling, even now, Dorothy, do you fully realize what you were doing? All your life to be tied—"
"Hush!" Her finger was on his lips, only to be kissed till she took it away. "I won't let you talk like that a minute, not a single minute. But, Keith, there is something I want you to say." Her voice was half pleading, half whimsical. Her eyes, through her tears, were studying his face, turned partly away from her. "Confession is good for the soul."
"Well, anything more?" He smiled faintly.
"Yes, only this time it's you. You've got to do it."
"I?"
"Yes." Her voice rang with firm decision. "Keith, I want to know why. Why all this time you've acted so that I had to find out through Susan that you cared. And I want to know when you stopped hating me and—"
"Dorothy, I never hated you," cut in the man passionately.
"But you acted as if you did. Why, you wouldn't let me come near you, and you were so angry with me."
"Yes, I know."
The man fell back in his chair and was silent. There was a long minute of waiting. "Keith?"
"Yes, dear."
"I confessed mine, and yours can't be any harder than mine was." Still he hesitated. Then, with a long breath, he began to speak.
"Dorothy, it's just that I've had so much to fight, and it hasn't been easy. But listen, dear. I think I've loved you from way back in the days when you wore your hair in 2 thick pigtails down your back. You know I was only 14 when the shadows began to come. One day, away back then, I saw you shudder once at blindness. We were talking about old Joe Harrington, and I never forgot it."
"But it was only because I pitied him."
"Yes, but I thought then that it was more aversion. You said you couldn't bear to look at them, and you see I feared even then that I was going to be like old Joe sometime."
"Oh, Keith!"
"Well, it came. I was like old Joe, blind, and I knew that I was the object of curiosity and pity, and I believed aversion wherever I went. And oh, I so hated it. I didn't want to be stared at and pointed at and pitied. I didn't want to be different. And above all, I didn't want to know that you were turning away from me in aversion and disgust."
"Oh, Keith, Keith, as if I ever could," faltered the girl.
"I thought you could and would. I used to picture you all in the dark, as I used to see you with your bright eyes and pretty hair, and I could see the look on your face as you turned away shuddering. That's when I determined at all costs to keep out of your sight until I should be well again. I was going to be well, of course, then, you know. Well, in time I went west, and on my way I met Miss Stewart."
"Yes?"
Dorothy's voice was not quite steady. "I liked Miss Stewart. She was wonderfully good to me. At the very first, she gave me quite a start. Her voice sounded so much like Dorothy Parkman's. But very soon I forgot that, and just gave myself up to the enjoyment of her companionship. I wasn't afraid with her that her eyes were turned away in aversion and disgust. Some way I just knew that she wasn't like Dorothy Parkman. You see, I hadn't forgotten Dorothy. Some day I was going back to her, seeing. Well, you know what happened. The operations, the specialists, the years of waiting, the trip to London, then home, hopelessly blind. It was not easy then, Dorothy, but I tried to be a man. Most of all I felt for Dad. He had so many hopes. But never mind, and anyhow, what Susan said the other day helped. But this has nothing to do with you, dear. To go on, I gave you up then definitely. I know that all the while I'd been having you back in my mind, young as I was, that some day I was going to be big and strong and rich and have my eyes, and that then I was going to ask you to marry me. But when I got home, hopelessly blind, that ended it. I didn't believe you would have me anyway, but even if you would, I wasn't going to give you the chance of always having to turn away in aversion and disgust from the sight of your husband."
"Oh, Keith, how could you?"
"I couldn't, but you see how I felt. Then one day I heard Miss Stewart's voice in the hall, and oh, how good it sounded to me. I think I must have caught her hand very much as the drowning man grasps at the straw. She would never turn away from me. With her I felt safe, happy, and at peace. I don't think I exactly understood my state of mind myself. I didn't think I was in love with her, yet with her I was happy, and I was never afraid. But I didn't have a chance long to question. Almost at once came the day when Mazie Sanborn ran up the steps and spoke to you, and I knew. My whole world seemed tumbling to destruction in one blinding crash. You can never know, dear, how utterly dismayed and angry and helpless I felt. All that I knew was that for months and months I had let Dorothy Parkman read to me, play with me, and talk to me, and that I had been eager to take all the time she would give me, when all the while she had been doing it out of pity, of course, and I could see just how she must have been shuddering and turning away her eyes all the long, long weeks she had been with me at different times. But even more than that, if possible, was the chagrin and dismay with which I realized that all the while I had been cheated and deceived and made a fool of, because I was blind and I could not see. I had been tricked into putting myself in such a position.
"No, no, you didn't understand," protested the girl.
"Of course I didn't understand, dear. Nobody who's blinded with rage and hurt pride can understand anything rightly."
"But you wouldn't let me explain afterwards."
"No, I didn't want you to explain. I was too sore, too deeply hurt, well, I couldn't. That's all. Besides, I didn't want you to know how much I was caring about it all. So, a little later, when I did see you, I tried to toss it all off lightly, as if no consequence whatever."
"Well, you succeeded," commented Dorothy dryly.
"I had to, you see. I had found out then how much I really did care. I knew then that somehow you and Miss Stewart were hopelessly mixed up in my heart, and that I loved you, and that the world without you was going to be one big desert of loneliness and longing. You see, it had not been so hard to give you up in imagination, but when it came to the real thing—"
"But, Keith, why did you insist that you must?"
Do you think I'd ask you or anybody to tie yourself to a hopeless creature who would probably finally end up on a street corner with a tin cup for pennies? Besides, in your case, I had not forgotten the shudders and the averted eyes. I still was so sure. Then John McGuire came home blind, and after a while I found I could help him. And, Dorothy, this is when I learned that perhaps you were as happy in doing things for me as I had been in doing them for John McGuire. I sort of forgot the shudders and the averted eyes then. Besides, along about that time we had got back to almost our old friendliness, the friendliness and companionship of Miss Stewart and me. Then the money came, and I knew that at least I never should have to ask you to subsist on what the tin cup of pennies could bring, and I had almost begun to actually plan when all of a sudden you stopped coming right off short.
"But I went away," defended the girl a little faintly.
"Not at once. You were here in town a long time after that. I knew because I used to hear about you. I was sure then that you had seen I was caring for you, so you stayed away. Besides, it came back to me again, my old fear of your pity and aversion, of your eyes turned away. You see, always, dear, that's been a sort of obsession with me, I guess. I hate to feel that any one is looking at me, watching me. To me it seems like spying on me, because I can't look back. Yes, I know it's all very foolish and very silly, but we are all foolish and silly over something. It's because of that feeling that I so hate to enter a room and know that someone is there who won't speak, who tries to cheat me into thinking I'm alone. I can't bear it, Dorothy, just because I can't see them."
I know, nodded the girl.
"Well, in December you went away. Oh, I knew when you went. I knew a lot of things that you didn't know I knew. But I was trying all those days to put you quite out of my mind, and I busied myself with John McGuire, told myself that I was satisfied with my work, that I had put you entirely out of my life. Then you came back in February, and I knew I hadn't. I knew I loved you more than ever. Just at first, the very first, I thought you had come back to me. Then I saw that it was Dad. After that I tried, oh, you don't know how hard I tried, to kill that wicked love in my heart. Why, darling, nothing would have hired me to let you see it then. Let Dad, knowing that his loving you hurt me. Fail Dad there, as I had failed him everywhere else? I guess not. This was something I could do. I could let him have you and never, never let him know. So I buried myself in work and tried to forget. Then today you came. At the first sound of your voice in there, when I realized what you were saying, to Dad, I supposed, I started up and would have gone. Then I was afraid you would see me pass the window, and that it would be worse if I went than if I stayed. Besides, right away I heard the words that made me so weak with joy and amazement that my knees bent under me and I had to sit down. And then, but you know the rest, dear.
Yes, I know the rest, and I'll tell you sometime why I stopped coming last fall.
All right, but even that doesn't matter to me now. For now, in spite of my blind eyes, the way looks all rosy ahead. Why, dear, it's like the dawn of a new day, and I used to so love the dawn. You don't know, but years ago, with Dad, I'd go camping in the woods, and sometimes we'd stay all night on the mountain. I loved that, for in the morning we'd watch the sun come up and flood the world with light, and it seemed so wonderful after the dark. And it's like that with me today, dear. It's my dawn, the dawn of a new day, and it's so wonderful after the dark.
Oh, Keith, I'm so glad. And listen, dear, it's not only dawn for you, but for all those blind boys down there that you're helping. You have opened their eyes to their dawn, of their new day. Don't you see? Keith drew in his breath with a little catch.
Have I? Do you think I have? Oh, I should like to think that. I don't know, of course, about them, but I do know about myself. And I know it's the most wonderful dawn ever was for me. And I know that with your little hand in mine, I'll walk fearlessly straight on with my chin up. And now that I know Dad doesn't care, and that he isn't going to be unhappy about my loving you and your loving me, I haven't even that to fear."
"And, oh, Keith, think what it would have been if I hadn't defied the properties," she faltered mistily.
"Dear old Susan, bless her heart! And that isn't all I owe her. Something she said the other day had made me hope that maybe I hadn't even quite failed Dad. And I so wanted to make good for Dad."
"And you've done it, Keith."
"But maybe he doesn't think so."
"But he does. He told me."
"He told you?"
"Yes, last night. He said that once he had great plans for you, great ambitions, but that he never dreamed he could be as proud of you as he is right now, what you had done for yourself and what you were doing for those boys down there."
"Dad said that?"
"Yes."
"And to think of my having that, and you too," breathed the man, his arm tightening about her. The end. End of chapter 33. Recording by Sunny.
End of Dawn by Eleanor H. Porter.